Chapter 12 of the Life of Washington, Volume 1, by John Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12, Preparations for the Campaign of 1758. Admiral Boscawen and General Amherst arrive at Halifax. Plan of the campaign, expedition against Louisbourg, Ticonderoga, and Crown Point. General Abercrombie repulsed under the walls of Ticonderoga. Fort Frontenac taken. Expedition against Fort Duquesne. Preparations for the campaign of 1759. General Amherst succeeds General Abercrombie. Plan of the campaign, Ticonderoga and Crown Point taken. Army goes into winter quarters. French repulsed at Oswego. Defeated at Niagara. Niagara taken. Expedition against Quebec. Check to the English army. Battle on the Plains of Abraham. Death of Wolfe and Montcalm. Quebec capitulates, garrisoned by the English under the command of General Murray. Attempt to recover Quebec. Battle near Sillery. Quebec besieged by Monsieur Lévis. Siege raised. Montreal capitulates. War with the Southern Indians. Battle near the town of Echo. Grant defeats them and burns their towns. Treaty with the Cherokees. War with Spain. Success of the English. Peace. 1758. The affairs of Great Britain in North America wore a more gloomy aspect at the close of the campaign of 1757 than at any former period. By the acquisition of Fort William Henry, the French had obtained complete possession of the lakes Champlain and George. By the destruction of Oswego, they had acquired the dominion of those lakes which connect the St. Lawrence with the waters of the Mississippi and unite Canada to Louisiana. By means of Fort Duquesne, they maintained their ascendancy over the Indians and held undisturbed possession of the country west of the Allegheny Mountains, while the English settlers were driven to the Blue Ridge. The great object of the war in that quarter was gained, and France held the country for which hostilities had been commenced. With inferior numbers, the French had been victorious in every campaign, and had uniformly gained ground on the English colonies. Nor were they less successful elsewhere. The flame of war, which was kindled in America, had communicated itself to Europe and Asia. In every quarter of the world where hostilities had been carried on, the British arms were attended with defeat and disgrace. But this inglorious scene was about to be succeeded by one of unrivaled brilliancy. From the point of extreme depression to which their affairs had sunk, the brightest era of British history was to commence. Far from being broken by misfortune, the spirit of the nation was high, and more of indignation than dismay was inspired by the ill success of their arms. The public voice had at length made its way to the throne, and had forced on the unwilling monarch a minister who has been justly deemed one of the greatest men of the age in which he lived. Mr. Pitt had been long distinguished in the House of Commons for the boldness and the splendor of his eloquence. His parliamentary talents and the independent grandeur of his character had given him a great ascendancy in that body, and had made him the idol of the nation. In 1756 he had been introduced into the cabinet, but could not long retain his place. The public affection followed him out of office, and the national disasters continuing, it was found impracticable to conduct the complicated machine of government without his aid. In the summer of 1757, an administration was formed which conciliated the great contending interests in Parliament, and Mr. Pitt was placed at its head. The controlling superiority of his character gave him the same ascendancy in the cabinet which he had obtained in the House of Commons, and he seemed to dictate the measures of the nation. Only a short time was required to show that qualities seldom united in the same person were combined in him, and his talents for action seemed to eclipse even those he had displayed in debate. His plans, partaking of the proud elevation of his own mind and the exalted opinion he entertained of his countrymen, were always grand, and the means he employed for their execution were always adequate to the object. Possessing the public confidence without limitation, he commanded all the resources of the nation, and drew liberally from the public purse, but the money was always faithfully and judiciously applied to the public service. Too great in his spirit, too lofty in his views, to become the instrument of faction, when placed at the head of the nation, he regarded only the interest of the nation, and overlooking the country or the party, which had given birth to merit, he searched for merit only and employed it wherever it was found. From the elevation of the House of Brunswick to the British throne, a great portion of the people, under the denomination of Tories, had been degraded, persecuted, and oppressed. Superior to this narrow and short-sighted policy, Mr. Pitt sought to level these enfeebling and irritating distinctions, and to engage every British subject in the cause of his country. Thus, commanding both the strength and the wealth of the kingdom, with perhaps greater talents, he possessed certainly greater means than any of his predecessors. In no part of His Majesty's dominions was the new administration more popular than in his American colonies. Deeply and peculiarly interested in the events of the war, they looked for a change of fortune from this change of men, and cheerfully made every exertion of which they were capable for the ensuing campaign. The circular letter of Mr. Pitt assured the several governors that, to repair the losses and disappointments of the last inactive campaign, the cabinet was determined to send a formidable force to operate by sea and land against the French in America, and he called upon them to raise as large bodies of men within their respective governments as the number of inhabitants might allow. Arms, ammunition, tents, provisions, and boats would, he said, be furnished by the Crown, and he required the colonies to clothe and pay their men, assuring them at the same time that it should be recommended to Parliament to make them compensation. Great preparations for the campaign. The legislature of Massachusetts agreed to furnish 7,000 men, Connecticut 5,000, and New Hampshire 3,000. These troops, great as were their numbers when compared with the population of the country, were in the field early in May, and the transports for carrying those of Massachusetts to Halifax were ready to sail in 15 days after they were engaged. Near one-third of the effective men of that province are said to have been in military service, and the taxes were so heavy that in the capital they amounted to two-thirds of the income of real estate. In the mother country, too, the utmost activity was transfused into every department. Her fleets blocked up in the French ports the men and stores designed for Canada, and captured on the seas most of those which had been able to make their way into the ocean. Admiral Boscawen and General Amherst arrived. At the same time, a powerful armament, equipped with unusual expeditions, sailed from her ports. Early in the spring, Admiral Boscawen arrived at Halifax with a formidable fleet and 12,000 British troops under the command of General Amherst. The Earl of Loudon had returned to England, and the command of the British and American forces in the colonies had devolved on General Abercrombie. That officer found himself at the head of the most powerful army ever seen in the New World. His whole numbers, comprehending troops of every description, have been computed by Mr. Belsham at 50,000 men, of whom 20,000 were provincials. The objects of the campaign were no longer defeated by delays. The preparations for action were made during the winter, and military operations commenced in the spring. Plan of the campaign. 3 expeditions were proposed. The first was against Louisbourg, the second against Ticonderoga and Crown Point, and the third against Fort Duquesne. Expedition against Louisbourg. The army destined against Louisbourg, consisting of 14,000 men, was commanded by Major General Amherst, and the fleet, consisting of 20 ships of the line and 18 frigates, by Admiral Boscawen. On the 24th of May, the troops embarked at Halifax, and on the 2nd of June arrived before Louisbourg. The use made by Great Britain of her naval superiority was felt in no part of the possessions of His Most Christian Majesty more sensibly than in Louisbourg. The garrison of that important place was composed of only 2,500 regulars, aided by 600 militia. The harbor was defended by 5 ships of the line, 1 ship of 50 guns, and 5 frigates, 3 of which were sunk across the mouth of the basin. Soon after investment of the place, one of the large ships was set on fire by a bomb from a battery on the lighthouse point and blown up. The flames were communicated to 2 others which shared the same fate. The English admiral then sent a detachment of 600 seamen in boats into the harbor under Captains La Force and Balfour to make an attempt on the 2 remaining ships of the line, which still kept possession of the basin. This service was executed with great gallantry. One which was aground was destroyed, and the other was towed off in triumph. The harbor being in possession of the English, and several practicable breaches made in the works, the place was no longer deemed defensible, and the governor was under the necessity of capitulating. The garrison became prisoners of war, and Louisbourg, with its artillery, provisions, and military stores, and also Island Royal, St. John's, and their dependencies were surrendered to the English, who encountered no farther difficulty in taking possession of the whole island. This important acquisition was made with a loss of between 500 and 600 men killed and wounded. The joy it diffused throughout the colonies, long familiarized to disaster, was in proportion to their former disappointments. Against Ticonderoga. The expedition against Ticonderoga and Crown Point was conducted by General Abercrombie in person. His army, consisting of near 16,000 effectives, of whom 9,000 were provincials, was attended by a formidable train of artillery and possessed every requisite to insure success. On the 5th of July he embarked on Lake George and reached the landing place early the next morning. A disembarkation being effected without opposition, the troops were immediately formed into 4 columns, the British in the center and the provincials on the flanks, in which order they marched towards the advance guard of the French, composed of 1 battalion posted in a log camp, which on the approach of the English made a precipitate retreat. Abercrombie continued his march towards Ticonderoga with the intention of investing that place, but the woods being thick and the guides unskilful, his columns were thrown into confusion and in some measure entangled with each other. In this situation Lord Howe, at the head of the right center column, fell in with a part of the advance guard of the French, which in retreating from Lake George was likewise lost in the wood. He immediately attacked and dispersed them, killing several and taking 148 prisoners, among whom were 5 officers. This small advantage was purchased at a dear rate, though only 2 officers on the side of the British were killed. One of these was Lord Howe himself, who fell on the first fire. This gallant young nobleman had endeared himself to the whole army. The British and provincials alike lamented his death, and the Assembly of Massachusetts passed a vote for the erection of a superb cenotaph to his memory in the Collegiate Church of Westminster among the heroes and patriots of Great Britain. Without further opposition, the English army took possession of the post at the sawmills within 2 miles of Ticonderoga. This fortress, which commands the communication between the 2 lakes, is encompassed on 3 sides by water and secured in front by a morass. The ordinary garrison, amounting to 4,000 men, was stationed under the cannon of the place and covered by a breastwork, the approach to which had been rendered extremely difficult by trees felled in front, with their branches outward, many of which were sharpened so as to answer the purpose of chevaux de frise. This body of troops was rendered still more formidable by its general than by its position. It was commanded by the Marquis de Montcalm. Having learned from his prisoners the strength of the army under the walls of Ticonderoga, and that a reinforcement of 3,000 men was daily expected, General Abercrombie thought it advisable to storm the place before this reinforcement should arrive. Being informed by an engineer directed to reconnoiter the works that they were unfinished and were practicable, he resolved, without waiting for his artillery, to storm the lines, and the dispositions for an assault were instantly made. The Rangers, the light infantry, and the right wing of the provincials were ordered to form a line out of cannon shot of the entrenchments, with their right extending to Lake George and their left to Lake Champlain. The regulars who were to storm the works were formed in the rear of this line. The piquets were to begin the attack and to be sustained by the grenadiers, and the grenadiers by the battalions. The whole were ordered to march up briskly, to rush upon the enemy's fire, and to reserve their own until they had passed the breastwork. The troops marched to the assault with great intrepidity, but their utmost efforts could make no impression on the works. The impediments in front of the entrenchments retarded the advance and exposed them, while entangled among the boughs of the trees, to a very galling fire. The breastwork itself was 8 or 9 feet high, and much stronger than had been represented, so that the assailants, who did not appear to have been furnished with ladders, were unable to pass it. After a contest of near 4 hours and several repeated attacks, General Abercrombie ordered a retreat. General Abercrombie repulsed under the walls of Ticonderoga. The army retired to the camp from which it had marched in the morning, and the next day resumed its former position on the south side of Lake George. In this rash attempt, the killed and wounded of the English amounted to near 2,000 men, of whom not quite 400 were provincials. The French were covered during the whole action, and their loss was inconsiderable. Entirely disconcerted by this unexpected and bloody repulse, General Abercrombie relinquished his designs against Ticonderoga and Crown Point, searching, however, for the means of repairing the misfortune, if not the disgrace, sustained by his arms. He readily acceded to a proposition made by Colonel Bradstreet for an expedition against Fort Frontenac. This fortress stands on the north side of Ontario, at the point where the St. Lawrence issues from that lake, and though a post of real importance had been left in a great degree undefended. The detachment designed for this service was commanded by Colonel Bradstreet. It consisted of 3,000 men, of whom 200 were British, and was furnished with 8 pieces of cannon and 3 mortars. Fort Frontenac taken. Colonel Bradstreet embarked on the Ontario at Oswego, and on the 25th of August landed within 1 mile of the fort. In 2 days his batteries were opened at so short a distance that almost every shell took effect, and the governor, finding the place absolutely untenable, surrendered at discretion. The Indians having deserted, the prisoners amounted only to 110 men. A great quantity of military stores, together with 9 armed vessels mounting from 8 to 18 guns, also fell into the hands of the English. After destroying the fort and vessels, and such stores as could not be brought off, Colonel Bradstreet returned to the army, which undertook nothing farther during the campaign. Expedition against Fort Duquesne. The demolition of Fort Frontenac and of the stores which had been collected there contributed materially to the success of the expedition against Fort Duquesne. The conduct of this enterprise had been entrusted to General Forbes, who marched from Philadelphia about the beginning of July at the head of the main body of the army destined for this service, in order to join Colonel Bouquet at Raystown. So much time was employed in preparing to move from this place that the Virginia regulars, commanded by Colonel Washington, were not ordered to join the British troops until the month of September. It had been determined not to use the road made by Braddock, but to cut a new one from Raystown to Fort Duquesne. About the time this resolution was formed, and before the army was put in motion, Major Grant was detached from the advanced post at Loyalhannon with 800 men to reconnoiter the fort and the adjacent country. This gentleman invited an attack from the garrison, the result of which was that upwards of 300 of the detachment were killed and wounded, and Major Grant himself was made a prisoner. Fort Duquesne evacuated. Early in October, General Forbes moved from Raystown, but the obstructions to his march were so great that he did not reach Fort Duquesne until late in November. The garrison, being deserted by the Indians and too weak to maintain the place against the formidable army which was approaching, abandoned the fort the evening before the arrival of the British and escaped down the Ohio in boats. The English placed a garrison in it and changed its name to Pittsburgh in compliment to their popular minister. The acquisition of this post was of great importance to Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. Its possession had given the French an absolute control over the Indians of the Ohio, who were accustomed to assemble at that place for the purpose of making their destructive incursions into those colonies. Their route was marked by fire and the scalping knife, and neither age nor sex could afford exemption from their ferocity. The expulsion of the French gave the English entire possession of the country and produced a complete revolution in the disposition of the Indians inhabiting it. Finding the current of success to be running against their ancient friends, they were willing to reconcile themselves to the most powerful, and all the Indians between the lakes and the Ohio concluded a peace with the English. Although the events of 1758 did not equal the expectations which had been formed from the force brought into the field, the advantages were decisive. The whole country, constituting the original cause of the war, had changed masters and was in possession of the English. The acquisition of the island of Cape Breton opened the way to Quebec, and their success in the West enabled them to direct all their force against Canada. The colonists, encouraged by this revolution in their affairs, and emboldened by the conquests already made to hope for others still more extensive, prepared vigorously on the application of Mr. Pitt for the farther prosecution of the war. General Amherst succeeds General Abercrombie. Late in the year 1758, General Abercrombie was succeeded in the command of the army by Major General Amherst, who formed the bold plan of conquering Canada in the course of the ensuing campaign. 1759, the decided superiority of Great Britain at sea and the great exertions of France in other quarters of the world still prevented the arrival of such reinforcements as were necessary for the preservation of His Most Christian Majesty's possessions in North America. Plan of the campaign. To take advantage of this weakness, the English proposed to enter Canada by 3 different routes, with 3 powerful armies, and to attack all the strongholds by which that country was defended. It was determined that one division of the army, to be commanded by Brigadier General Wolfe, a young officer who had signalized himself in the siege of Louisbourg, should ascend the St. Lawrence and lay siege to Quebec. A strong fleet was to escort the troops destined for this enterprise and to cooperate with them. Major General Amherst was to lead the central and main army against Ticonderoga and Crown Point. After making himself master of these places, he was to proceed over Lake Champlain and by the way of Richelieu to the St. Lawrence and down that river, so as to effect a junction with General Wolfe before the walls of Quebec. From their combined force, the conquest of the capital of Canada was expected. The Third Army was to be commanded by General Prideaux. Its first destination was against Niagara. After the reduction of this place, Prideaux was to embark on Lake Ontario and proceed down the St. Lawrence against Montreal. Should Montreal fall into his hands before the surrender of Quebec, he was to join the Grand Army at that place. It could not be expected that a plan so extensive and so complex should succeed in all its parts, and it was greatly to be apprehended that the failure of one part might defeat the whole, but it suited the daring spirit which eminently distinguished the officers then commanding the British forces, and was entered upon with zeal and activity. As the other two expeditions, especially that against Quebec, were supposed to depend greatly on the celerity with which the movements of the main army should be made, General Amherst began his preparations in the commencement of winter for the enterprise he was to undertake. Early in the spring he transferred his headquarters from New York to Albany, where his troops were assembled by the last of May. Notwithstanding his continued exertions, the summer was far advanced before he could cross Lake George. Ticonderoga abandoned, nor did he reach Ticonderoga until the 22nd of July. The lines drawn around that place were immediately abandoned, and the English took possession of them. The French troops in this quarter being unequal to the defense of the posts they held, their object seems to have been to embarrass and delay the invading army, but not to hazard any considerable diminution of strength by persevering in the defense of places until the retreat of the garrison should become impracticable. The hope was entertained that by retreating from post to post and making a show of intending to defend each, the advance of the English might be retarded until the season for action on the lake should pass away, while the French would be gradually strengthened by concentration and thus enabled to maintain some point which would arrest the progress of Amherst down the St. Lawrence. In pursuance of this plan, as soon as the English had completed their arrangements for taking possession of Lake Champlain, the garrison of Ticonderoga retreated to Crown Point. And Crown Point, early in the month of August, Amherst advanced to Crown Point, which was abandoned on his approach, and the garrison retired to Isle aux Noix at the northern extremity of Lake Champlain. The French had collected between 3,000 and 4,000 men at this place, in an entrenched camp defended by artillery and protected by several armed vessels on the lake. After making great exertions to obtain a naval superiority, General Amherst embarked his army on Lake Champlain, but a succession of storms compelling him to abandon the farther prosecution of the enterprise, he returned to Crown Point, where the troops were put into winter quarters. In the beginning of July, General Prideaux embarked on Lake Ontario with the army destined against Niagara. Immediately after his departure from Oswego, that place, which was defended by 1,200 men under the command of Colonel Haldeman, was vigorously attacked by a body of French and Indians, who were repulsed with some loss. In the meantime, Prideaux proceeded towards Niagara and landed without opposition about 3 miles from the fort. The place was invested in form, and the siege was carried on by regular approaches. In its progress, General Prideaux was killed by the bursting of a cohorn, and the command devolved on General Johnson. Great efforts were made to relieve this important place. A considerable body of troops, drawn from the neighboring garrisons, aided by some Indian auxiliaries, advanced on the English army with the determination to risk a battle in order to raise the siege. Early in the morning of the 24th, the approach of this party was announced, and a strong detachment marched out to meet it. The action, which immediately commenced, was not of long duration. The French were forsaken by their savage allies, and victory soon declared in favor of the English. Niagara capitulates. This battle decided the fate of Niagara. The works of the besiegers had been pushed within 100 yards of the walls, and a farther attempt to defend the place being hopeless, a capitulation was signed, by which the garrison, amounting to rather more than 600 men, became prisoners of war. Although important advantages were gained by the British arms in Upper Canada, yet as neither division of the army in that quarter succeeded so completely as to cooperate with General Wolfe, serious fears were entertained for the fate of that officer. The enterprise conducted by him being of the greatest hazard and of the deepest interest, its success was to decide whether the whole campaign would terminate in a manner favorable to the future conquest of Canada. Expedition against Quebec. As soon as the waters were sufficiently freed from ice to be navigable, Wolfe embarked 8,000 men with formidable train of artillery at Louisbourg, under convoy of Admiral Saunders and Holmes. Late in June he anchored about halfway up the island of Orleans, on which he landed without opposition. From this position he could take a near and accurate view of the obstacles to be surmounted before he could hope for success in his enterprise. These were so great that even his bold and sanguine temper perceived more to fear than to hope, and in a celebrated letter written to Mr. Pitt, and afterwards published, he declared that he could not flatter himself with being able to reduce the place. Quebec stands on the north side of the St. Lawrence and on the west of the St. Charles, which rivers unite immediately below the town. It consists of an upper and a lower town. The latter is built upon the strand, which stretches along the base of the lofty rock on which the former is situated. This rock continues with a bold and steep front far to the westward, parallel to and near the river St. Lawrence. On this side, therefore, the city might well be deemed inaccessible. On the other, it was protected by the river St. Charles, in which were several armed vessels and floating batteries, deriving additional security from a strong boom drawn across its mouth. The channel of this river is rough and broken, and its borders intersected with ravines. On its left or eastern bank was encamped a French army, strongly entrenched, and amounting, according to the English accounts, to 10,000 men. The encampment extended from St. Charles eastward to the Montmorency, and its rear was covered by an almost impenetrable wood. To render this army still more formidable, it was commanded by a general who had given signal proofs of active courage and consummate prudence. The Marquis de Montcalm, who, when strong enough to act offensively, had so rapidly carried Oswego and Fort William Henry, and who, when reduced to the defensive, had driven Abercrombie with such slaughter from the walls of Ticonderoga, was now at the head of the army which covered Quebec, and was an antagonist in all respects worthy of Wolfe. The British general perceived these difficulties in their full extent, but his ardent mind, glowing with military enthusiasm, sought only how to subdue them. He took possession of Point Levis on the southern side of the St. Lawrence, where he erected several heavy batteries, which opened on the town, but were at too great a distance to make any considerable impression on the works. Nor could his ships be employed in this service. The elevation of the principal fortifications placed them beyond the reach of the guns of the fleet, and the river was so commanded by the batteries on shore as to render a station near the town ineligible. The English general, sensible of the impracticability of reducing Quebec, unless he should be enabled to erect his batteries on the north side of the St. Lawrence, determined to use his utmost endeavors to bring Montcalm to an engagement. After several unavailing attempts to draw that able officer from his advantageous position, Wolfe resolved to pass the Montmorency and to attack him in his entrenchments. In consequence of this resolution, 13 companies of British grenadiers and part of the 2nd Battalion of Royal Americans were landed near the mouth of the Montmorency under cover of the cannon of the ships, while 2 divisions under Generals Townsend and Murray prepared to cross that river higher up. The original plan was to make the first attack on a detached redoubt close to the water's edge, apparently unprotected by the fire from the entrenchments, in the hope that Montcalm might be induced to support this work and thereby enable Wolfe to bring on a general engagement. On the approach of the British troops, this redoubt was evacuated. Observing some confusion in the French camp, Wolfe determined to avail himself of the supposed impression of the moment and to storm the lines. With this view, he directed the grenadiers and Royal Americans to form on the breach, where they were to wait until the whole army could be arranged to sustain them. Orders were at the same time dispatched to Townsend and Murray to be in readiness for fording the river. The grenadiers and Royal Americans, disregarding their orders, rushed forward with impetuous valor on the entrenchments of the enemy. They were received with so steady and well supported a fire that they were thrown into confusion and compelled to retreat. The English army repulsed. The general advancing in person with the remaining brigades, the fugitives formed again in the rear of the army, but the plan of the attack was effectually disconcerted, and the English commander gave orders for repassing the river and returning to the island of Orleans. Convinced by this disaster of the impracticability of approaching Quebec on the side of the Montmorency, Wolfe again turned his whole attention to the St. Lawrence to destroy some ships of war lying in the river, and at the same time to distract the attention of Montcalm by descents at different places. 1,200 men were embarked in transports under the command of General Murray, who made 2 vigorous but unsuccessful attempts to land on the northern shore. In the third, he was more fortunate. In a sudden descent on Chambord, he burnt a valuable magazine filled with military stores, but was still unable to accomplish the main object of the expedition. The ships were secured in such a manner as not to be approached by the fleet or army. Murray was recalled, and on his return brought with him the intelligence that Niagara was taken, that Ticonderoga and Crown Point had been abandoned, and that General Amherst was making preparations to attack the Ile aux Noix. This intelligence, though joyfully received, promised no immediate assistance, and the season for action was rapidly wasting away. Nor was it easy for Wolfe to avoid contrasting the success of the British arms under other auspices with the ill fortune attending his own. A council of war having determined that all their future efforts should be directed towards effecting a landing above the town, the troops were withdrawn from the islands of Orleans and embarked on board the fleet. Some of them were landed at Point Levy, and the residue carried higher up the river. Montcalm could not view this movement without alarm. That part of Quebec which faces the country had not been well fortified, and he was apprehensive that a landing might be effected high up the river and the town approached on its weak side. At the same time, he could not safely relinquish his position, because the facility of transportation which the command of the water gave the English would enable them to seize the ground he then occupied should his army be moved above the town. Thus embarrassed, he detached M. de Bougainville with 1,500 men to watch the motions of the English and to prevent their landing. In this state of things, Wolfe formed the bold and hazardous plan of landing in the night, a small distance above the city on the northern bank of the river, and by scaling a precipice accessible only by a narrow path and therefore but weakly guarded, to gain the heights in the rear of the town. This resolution being taken, the admiral moved up the river several leagues above the place where the landing was to be attempted, and made demonstrations of an intention to disembark a body of troops at different places. During the night a strong detachment in flat-bottomed boats fell silently down with the tide to the place fixed on for the descent. This was made an hour before daybreak, about a mile above Cape Diamond, Wolfe being the first man who leaped on shore. The Highlanders and light infantry who composed the van, under the particular command of Colonel Howe, had been directed to secure a 4-gun battery defending an entrenched path by which the heights were to be ascended, and to cover the landing of the remaining troops. The violence of the current forced them rather below the point of disembarkation, a circumstance which increased their difficulties. However, scrambling up the precipice, they gained the heights and quickly dispersed the guard. The whole army followed up this narrow pass, and having encountered only a scattering fire from some Canadians and Indians, gained the summit by the break of day, when the several corps were formed under their respective leaders. The intelligence that the English had gained the heights of Abraham was soon conveyed to Montcalm, who comprehended at once the full force of the advantage obtained by his adversary, and prepared for the engagement which could no longer be avoided. Leaving his camp at Montmorency, he crossed the St. Charles for the purpose of attacking the English army. This movement was made in the view of Wolfe, who immediately formed his order of battle. His right wing was commanded by General Monckton and his left by General Murray. The right flank was covered by the Louisbourg Grenadiers, and the rear and left by the light infantry of Howe. The reserve consisted of Webb's regiment, drawn up in 8 subdivisions with large intervals between them. Montcalm had formed his 2 wings of European and colonial troops in nearly equal numbers. A column of Europeans composed his center, and 2 small field pieces were brought up to play on the English line. In this order he marched to the attack, advancing in his front about 1,500 militia and Indians, who kept an irregular and galling fire under cover of the bushes. The movements of the French indicating an intention to flank his left, General Wolfe ordered the battalion of Amherst and the 2 battalions of Royal Americans to that part of his line, where they were formed en potence under General Townsend, presenting a double front. Disregarding the fire of the militia and Indians, he ordered his troops to reserve themselves for the column advancing in the rear of these irregulars. Battle on the Plains of Abraham. Montcalm had taken post on the left of the French army, and Wolfe on the right of the British, so that the 2 generals met each other at the head of their respective troops, and there the battle was most severe. The French advanced briskly to the charge and commenced the action with great animation. The English reserved their fire until the enemy were within 40 yards of them, when they gave it with immense effect. The action was kept up for some time with great spirit. Death of Wolfe. Wolfe, advancing at the head of his grenadiers with charged bayonets, received a mortal wound and soon afterwards expired. Undismayed by the loss of their general, the English continued their exertions under Monckton, on whom the command devolved. He also received a ball through his body, and General Townsend took command of the British army. End of Montcalm. About the same time Montcalm received a mortal wound, and General Senezergus, the second in command, also fell. The left wing and center of the French began to give way, and being pressed close by the British, were driven from the field. On the left and rear of the English the action was less severe. The light infantry had been placed in houses, and Colonel Howe, the better to support them, had taken post still farther to the left, behind a copse. As the right of the French attacked the English left, he sallied from this position upon their flanks and threw them into disorder. In this critical moment Townsend advanced several platoons against their front and completely frustrated the attempt to turn the left flank. Victory of the English. In this state of the action, Townsend was informed that the command had devolved on him. Proceeding instantly to the center, he found that part of the army thrown into some disorder by the ardor of pursuit, and his immediate efforts were employed in restoring the line. Scarcely was this effected when M. de Bougainville, who had been detached as high as Cape Rouge to prevent the landing above, and who, on hearing that the English had gained the Plains of Abraham, hastened to the assistance of Montcalm, appeared in the rear at the head of 1,500 men. Fortunately for the English, the right wing of the French, as well as their left and center, had been entirely broken and driven off the field. 2 battalions and 2 pieces of artillery being advanced towards Bougainville, he retired, and Townsend did not think it advisable to risk the important advantages already gained by pursuing this fresh body of troops through a difficult country. In this decisive battle nearly equal numbers appear to have been engaged. The English, however, possessed this immense advantage. They were all veterans, while not more than half the French were of the same description. This circumstance would lead to an opinion that some motive, not well explained, must have induced Montcalm to hazard an action before he was assured of being joined by Bougainville. The French regulars were almost entirely cut to pieces. The loss of the English was not so considerable as the fierceness of the action would indicate. The killed and wounded were less than 600 men, but among the former was the commander-in-chief. This gallant officer, whose rare merit and lamented fate have presented a rich theme for panegyric to both the poet and historian, received a ball in his wrist in the commencement of the action, but wrapping a handkerchief around his arm, he continued to encourage his troops. Soon afterwards he received a shot in the groin, which he also concealed, and was advancing at the head of the grenadiers when a third bullet pierced his breast. Though expiring, it was with reluctance he permitted himself to be carried into the rear, where he displayed, in the agonies of death, the most anxious solicitude concerning the fate of the day. Being told that the enemy was visibly broken, he reclined his head from extreme faintness on the arm of an officer standing near him, but was soon roused with the distant cry of "They fly! They fly!" "Who fly?" exclaimed the dying hero. On being answered, "The French," then he said, "I depart content," and almost immediately expired, a death more glorious, as Mr. Belsham, and attended with circumstances more picturesque and interesting, is nowhere to be found in the annals of history. The less fortunate, but not less gallant, Montcalm expired on the same day. The same love of glory and the same fearlessness of death which so remarkably distinguished the British hero were equally conspicuous in his competitor for victory and for fame. He expressed the highest satisfaction on hearing that his wound was mortal, and when told that he could survive only a few hours, quickly replied, "So much the better. I shall not then live to see the surrender of Quebec." Quebec capitulates. The first days after the action were employed by General Townsend in making preparations for the siege of Quebec, but before his batteries were opened, the town capitulated, on condition that the inhabitants should during the war be protected in the free exercise of their religion and the full enjoyment of their civil rights, leaving their future destinies to be decided by the treaty of peace. Quebec was garrisoned by about 5,000 English under the command of General Murray, and the fleet sailed from the St. Lawrence. The English minister, aware of the importance of completing the work thus fortunately begun, was not of a temper to relax his exertions. His letters to the governors of the several colonies contained declarations of his intention to employ a strong military force for the ensuing year, and exhortations to them to continue their efforts for the annihilation of the French power in Canada. These exhortations were accompanied with assurances that he would again apply to Parliament to reimburse their future extraordinary expenses, and were productive of the desired effect. The several assemblies voted the same number of troops and amount of supplies as had been furnished the preceding year. In the meantime, the governor of New France and the general of the army made great exertions to retrieve their affairs and to avert the ruin which threatened them. The remaining European troops were collected about Montreal, where they were reinforced with 6,000 militia and a body of Indians. Monsieur de Lévis, on whom the command had devolved, determined to attempt the recovery of Quebec before the opening of the St. Lawrence should enable the English to reinforce the garrison and to afford it the protection of their fleet. But the outpost being found too strong to admit of his carrying the place by a coup de main, He was under the necessity of postponing the execution of this design until the upper part of the St. Lawrence should open and afford a transportation by water for his artillery and military stores. 1760, in the month of April, these were embarked at Montreal under convoy of 6 frigates, which, sailing down the St. Lawrence, while the army marched by land, reached Pointe aux Trembles in 10 days. To avoid the hardships and dangers of a siege in a town too extensive to be defended by his sickly garrison and inhabited by persons known to be hostile, Murray took the bold resolution of hazarding a battle. Having formed this determination, he led out his garrison to the heights of Abraham, battled near Sillery, and attacked the French near Sillery. He was received with unexpected firmness, and perceiving that his utmost efforts could make no impression, he called off his army and retired into the city. In this fierce encounter, the English loss amounted to near 1,000 men, and they represent that of the French to have been not less considerable. Quebec besieged. Monsieur de Lévis improved his victory to the utmost. His trenches were opened before the town on the same evening, but such was the difficulty of bringing up his heavy artillery that near a fortnight elapsed before he could mount his batteries and bring his guns to bear on the city. The batteries had been opened but a few days when the garrison was relieved from its perilous situation by the arrival of a British fleet. Quebec being secure, Monsieur de Lévis raised the siege and retired to Montreal. During these transactions, General Amherst was taking measures for the annihilation of the remnant of French power in Canada. He determined to employ the immense force under his command for the accomplishment of this object, and made arrangements during the winter to bring the armies from Quebec, Lake Champlain, and Lake Ontario to act against Montreal. The preparations being completed, the commander-in-chief marched at the head of upwards of 10,000 British and provincials from the frontiers of New York to Oswego, where he was joined by Sir William Johnson with 1,000 Indians. He embarked his army at that place and proceeded down the St. Lawrence to Montreal. Murray, who had been directed to advance up the river to the same point with as many men as could be spared from Quebec, appeared below the town on the very day that Amherst approached it from above. The two generals found no difficulty in disembarking their troops, and the whole plan of cooperation had been so well concerted that in a short time they were joined by Colonel Haviland with the detachment from Crown Point. Montreal capitulates. The junction of these armies presenting before Montreal a force not to be resisted, the governor offered to capitulate. In the month of September, Montreal and all other places within the government of Canada then remaining in the possession of France were surrendered to His Britannic Majesty. The troops were to be transported to France, and the Canadians to be protected in their property and the full enjoyment of their religion. That colossal power, which France had been long erecting in America with vast labor and expense, which had been the motive of one of the most extensive and desolating wars of modern times, was thus entirely overthrown. The causes of this interesting event are to be found in the superior wealth and population of the colonies of England, and in her immense naval strength and advantage in distant war, not to be counterbalanced by the numbers, the discipline, the courage, and the military talents which may be combined in the armies of an inferior maritime power. The Death of Wolfe on the Plains of Abraham, from the painting by Benjamin West in the capital at Ottawa, Canada. Surrounded by his devoted officers, General James Wolfe died in the hour of victory over the French General Montcalm, in which the English captured Quebec, September 13, 1759, and decided the destiny of North American civilization. General Wolfe lived to hear the cry, "They run," and expired with the words, "Now God be praised, I will die in peace." In the canvas, painted in 1771, West departed from the venerated custom of clothing pictorial characters in Greek or Roman costume. Sir Joshua Reynolds, who had endeavored to dissuade him, later said, "I retract my objections. I foresee that this picture will not only become one of the most popular, but will occasion a revolution in art." The joy diffused throughout the British dominions by this splendid conquest was mingled with a proud sense of superiority, which did not estimate with exact justice the relative means employed by the belligerents. In no part of those dominions was this joy felt in a higher degree or with more reason than in America. In that region, the wars between France and England had assumed a form happily unknown to other parts of the civilized world. Not confined, as in Europe, to men in arms, women and children were its common victims. It had been carried by the savage to the fireside of the peaceful peasant, where the tomahawk and scalping knife were applied indiscriminately to every age and to either sex. The hope was now fondly indulged that these scenes, at least in the northern and middle colonies, were closed forever. The colonies of South Carolina and Georgia had been entirely exempted from the sharp conflicts of the North. France having been unable to draw Spain into the war, their neighbors in Florida remained quiet and the Indians on their immediate frontiers were in the English interest. As the prospect of establishing peace in the north seemed to brighten, this state of repose in the south sustained a short interruption. When the garrison of Fort Duquesne retired down the Ohio into Louisiana, the French employed their address in the management of Indians to draw the Cherokees from their alliance with Great Britain. Their negotiations with these savages were favored by the irritations given to their warriors in Virginia, where they had been employed against the French and the Indians in the French interest. Their ill humor began to show itself in 1759. Upon its first appearance, Governor Lyttleton prepared to march into their country at the head of a respectable military force. Alarmed at these hostile appearances, they dispatched 32 of their chiefs to Charleston for the purpose of deprecating the vengeance with which their nation was threatened. Their pacific representations did not arrest the expedition. The governor not only persisted in the enterprise, but under the pretext of securing the safe return of the Indian messengers, took them into the train of his army, where they were in reality confined as prisoners. To add to this indignity, they were, when arrived at the place of destination, shut up together in a single hut. Notwithstanding the irritation excited by this conduct, a treaty was concluded, in which it was agreed that the chiefs detained by the governor should remain with him as hostages until an equal number of those who had committed murder on the frontiers should be delivered in exchange for them, and that in the meantime the Indians should seize and deliver up every white or red man coming into their country who should endeavor to excite them to war against the English. After making this accommodation, the governor returned to Charleston, leaving his hostages prisoners in Fort Prince George. Scarcely had the army retired when the Cherokees began to contrive plans for the relief of their chiefs. In an attempt to execute these plans, they killed the captain of the fort and wounded 2 officers. Orders were immediately given to put the hostages in irons, an indignity so resented by these fierce savages that the first persons who attempted to execute the orders were stabbed. The soldiers, enraged at this resistance, fell on the hostages and massacred them. War with the Southern Indians. Inflamed to madness by this event, the whole nation flew to arms, and according to their established mode of warfare, wreaked their fury on the inhabitants of the country in indiscriminate murder. Mr. Bull, on whom the government of the province had devolved, represented the distresses of South Carolina in such strong terms to General Amherst that Colonel Montgomery was ordered into that colony with a detachment of regular troops. He arrived in April, but as all the forces would be required in the north in order to complete the conquest of Canada, he was directed to strike a sudden blow and to return to New York in time for the expedition against Montreal. The utmost exertions were made by the colony in aid of Colonel Montgomery, and he entered the Cherokee country with all the forces that could be collected. Their lower towns were destroyed. Battle near Etcho. But near the village of Etcho, the first of their middle settlements, in an almost impenetrable wood, he was met by a large body of savages, and a severe action ensued. The English claimed the victory, but without much reason. They were so roughly handled that Colonel Montgomery withdrew his army and retired to Fort Prince George, at which place he prepared to embark for New York. The consternation of the province was the greater as serious fears were entertained that the Creeks and Choctaws might be induced by the French to join the Cherokees. Colonel Montgomery was pressed in the most earnest manner not to leave the province, and was with difficulty prevailed on to permit 4 companies to remain, while with the main body of his detachment he returned to New York. 1761. Meanwhile the war continued to rage. The savages surrounded Fort Loudon, and the garrison, amounting to 400 men, was compelled by famine to surrender on condition of being permitted to march into the settlements. The Indians, who regard conventions no longer than they are useful, attacked the garrison on its march, killed a number, and made the residue prisoners. Carolina again applied to General Amherst for assistance, who, having completed the conquest of Canada, had leisure to attend to the southern colonies. Late in May, a strong detachment, commanded by Colonel Grant, arrived at Fort Prince George, and the colony raised a body of provincials and of friendly Indians to join him. Early in June he marched for the Cherokee towns. Near the place where the action had been fought the preceding year by Montgomery, the Indians again assembled in force and gave battle in defense of their country. The action commenced about 8 in the morning and was maintained with spirit until 11, when the Cherokees began to give way. They were pursued for 2 or 3 hours, after which Grant marched to the adjacent village of Etcho, which he reduced to ashes. Indians defeated. All the towns of the middle settlement shared the same fate. Their houses and cornfields were destroyed, and the whole country laid waste. Reduced to extremity, they sued sincerely for peace, and in the course of the summer the war was terminated by a treaty. It was not in America only that the vigor presiding in the councils of Britain shed luster on the British arms. Splendid conquests were also made in Asia and Africa, and in Europe her aids of men and money enabled the greatest monarch of his age to surmount difficulties which only Frederick and Mr. Pitt could have dared to encounter. 1762, at length Spain, alarmed at the increase of British power in America, and apprehensive for the safety of her own dominions, determined to take part against Great Britain, and early in the year 1762 the two crowns declared war against each other. It was prosecuted on the part of Great Britain with signal success, and in the course of the year Martinique, Grenada, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and all the Caribbee islands were wrested from France, and the very important city of Havana, which in a great degree commands the Gulf of Mexico, was taken from Spain. The course of conquest, which no force in possession of France and Spain seemed capable of checking while any of their distant possessions remained to be subdued, was arrested by preliminary articles of peace signed at Paris. By this treaty His Christian Majesty ceded to Britain all the conquests made by that power on the continent of North America, together with the river and port of Mobile, and all the territory to which France was entitled on the left bank of the Mississippi, reserving only the island of New Orleans, and it was agreed that for the future the confines between the dominions of the two crowns in that quarter of the world should be irrevocably fixed by a line drawn along the middle of the Mississippi from its source as far as the river Iberville, and thence by a line drawn along the middle of that river and of the lakes Maurepas and Port Chartrain. The Havana was exchanged with Spain for the Floridas. By establishing these great natural boundaries to the British Empire in North America, all causes of future contest respecting that continent with any potentate of Europe were supposed to be removed. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of the Life of Washington, Volume 1, by John Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. Opinions on the Supremacy of Parliament and its right to tax the colonies, the Stamp Act, Congress at New York, violence in the towns, change of administration, Stamp Act repealed, opposition to the Mutiny Act, Act imposing duties on tea, etc., resisted in America, letters from the Assembly of Massachusetts to members of the administration, petition to the King, circular letter to the colonial assemblies, letter from the Earl of Hillsborough, Assembly of Massachusetts dissolved, seizure of the sloop Liberty, convention at Faneuil Hall, moderation of its proceedings, 2 British regiments arrive at Boston, resolutions of the House of Burgesses of Virginia, Assembly dissolved, the members form an association, general measures against importation, General Court convened in Massachusetts, its proceedings is prorogued, duties except that on tea repealed, circular letter of the Earl of Hillsborough, New York recedes from the non-importation agreement in part, her example followed, riot in Boston, trial and acquittal of Captain Preston. 1763, the attachment of the colonies to the mother country was never stronger than at the signature of the Treaty of Paris. The union of that tract of country which extends from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, and from the Gulf of Mexico to the North Pole, was deemed a certain guarantee of future peace and an effectual security against the return of those bloody scenes from which no condition in life could afford an exemption. This state of things, long and anxiously wished for by British America, had at length been effected by the union of British and American arms. The soldiers of the parent state and her colonies had cooperated in the same service, their blood had mingled in the same plains, and the object pursued was common to both people. While the British nation was endeared to the Americans by this community of danger and identity of interest, the brilliant achievements of the war had exalted to enthusiasm their admiration of British valor. They were proud of the land of their ancestors and gloried in their descent from Englishmen, but this sentiment was not confined to the military character of the nation. While the excellence of the English Constitution was a rich theme of declamation, every colonist believed himself entitled to its advantages, nor could he admit that, by crossing the Atlantic, his ancestors had relinquished the essential rights of British subjects. The degree of authority which might rightfully be exercised by the mother country over her colonies had never been accurately defined. In Britain it had always been asserted that Parliament possessed the power of binding them in all cases whatever. In America, at different times and in different provinces, different opinions had been entertained on this subject. In New England, originally settled by Republicans, habits of independence and nourished the theory that the colonial assemblies possessed every legislative power not surrendered by compact, that the Americans were subjects of the British Crown but not of the nation, and were bound by no laws to which their representatives had not assented. From this high ground they had been compelled reluctantly to recede. The judges, being generally appointed by the governors with the advice of council, had determined that the colonies were bound by acts of Parliament which concerned them, and which were expressly extended to them, and the General Court of Massachusetts had, on a late occasion, explicitly recognized the same principle. This had probably become the opinion of many of the best informed men of the province, but the doctrine seems still to have been extensively maintained that acts of Parliament possessed only an external obligation, that they might regulate commerce, but not the internal affairs of the colonies. In the year 1692, the General Court of Massachusetts passed an act denying the right of any other legislature to impose any tax whatever on the colony, and also asserting those principles of national liberty which are found in Magna Carta. Not long afterwards, the legislature of New York, probably with a view only to the authority claimed by the governor, passed an act in which its own supremacy, not only in matters of taxation, but of general legislation, is expressly affirmed. But these acts, however, were disapproved in England, and the Parliament asserted its authority in 1696 by declaring that all laws, by-laws, usages, and customs which shall be in practice in any of the plantations, repugnant to any law made to or to be made in this kingdom relative to the said plantations, shall be void and of none effect. And 3 years afterwards an act was passed for the trial of pirates in America, in which it is to be found the following extraordinary clause: "Be it farther declared that if any of the governors or any person or persons in authority there shall refuse to yield obedience to this act, such refusal is hereby declared to be a forfeiture of all and every the charters granted for government and propriety of such plantations." The English Statute Book furnishes many instances in which the legislative power of Parliament over the colonies was extended to regulations completely internal, and it is not recollected that their authority was in any case openly controverted. In the middle and southern provinces no question respecting the supremacy of Parliament in matters of general legislation ever existed. The authority of such acts of internal regulation as were made for America, as well as those for the regulation of commerce, even by the imposition of duties, provided those duties were imposed for the purpose of regulation, had been at all times admitted. But these colonies, however they might acknowledge the supremacy of Parliament in other respects, denied the right of that body to tax them internally. Their submission to the act for establishing a general post office, which raised a revenue on the carriage of letters, was not thought a dereliction of this principle, because that regulation was not considered as a tax, but as a compensation for a service rendered, which every person might accept or decline. And all the duties on trade were understood to be imposed rather with a view to prevent foreign commerce than to raise a revenue. Perhaps the legality of such acts was the less questioned because they were not rigorously executed, and their violation was sometimes designedly overlooked. A scheme for taxing the colonies by authority of Parliament had been formed so early as the year 1739, and recommended to government by a club of American merchants, at whose head was Sir William Keith, governor of Pennsylvania. In this scheme it was proposed to raise a body of regulars to be stationed along the western frontier of the British settlements for the protection of the Indian traders, the expense of which establishment was to be paid with moneys arising from a duty on stamped paper and parchment in all the colonies. This plan, however, was not countenanced by those in power, and seems never to have been seriously taken up by the government until the year 1754. The attention of that minister was then turned to a plan of taxation by authority of Parliament, and it will be recollected that a system was devised and recommended by him as a substitute for the Articles of Union proposed by the Convention at Albany. The temper and opinion of the colonists, and the impolicy of irritating them at a crisis which required all the exertions they were capable of making, suspended this delicate and dangerous measure, but it seems not to have been totally abandoned. Of the right of Parliament, as the supreme legislature of the nation, to tax as well as govern the colonies, those who guided the councils of Britain seem not to have entertained a doubt. And the language of men in power on more than one occasion through the war indicated a disposition to put this right in practice when the termination of hostilities should render the experiment less dangerous. The failure of some of the colonies, especially those in which a proprietary government was established, to furnish in time the aids required of them, contributed to foster this disposition. This opposition of opinion on a subject the most interesting to the human heart was about to produce a system of measures which tore asunder all the bonds of relationship and affection that had subsisted for ages, and planted almost inextinguishable hatred in bosoms where the warmest friendship had long been cultivated. 1764, the unexampled expenses of the war required a great addition to the regular taxes of the nation. Considerable difficulty was found in searching out new sources of revenue, and great opposition was made to every tax proposed. Thus embarrassed, administration directed its attention to the continent of North America. The system which had been laid aside was renewed, and on the motion of Mr. Grenville, first Commissioner of the Treasury, a resolution passed without much debate, declaring that it would be proper to impose certain stamp duties in the colonies and plantations for the purpose of raising a revenue in America payable into the British Exchequer. This resolution was not carried into immediate effect, and was but only declaratory of an intention to be executed the ensuing year. Other resolutions were passed at the same time, laying new duties on the trade of the colonies, which, being in the form of commercial regulations, were not generally contested on the ground of right, though imposed expressly for the purpose of raising revenue. Great disgust, however, was produced by the increase of the duties, by the new regulations which were made, and by the manner in which those regulations were to be executed. The gainful commerce long carried on clandestinely with the French and Spanish colonies, in the progress of which an evasion of the duties imposed by law had been overlooked by the government, was to be rigorously suppressed by taxes amounting to a prohibition of fair trade, and their exact collection was to be enforced by measures not much less offensive in themselves than on account of the object to be effected. Completely to prevent smuggling, all the officers in the sea service who were on the American station were converted into revenue officers and directed to take the custom house oaths. Many vexatious seizures were made, for which no redress could be obtained but in England, the penalties and forfeitures too accruing under the act, as if the usual tribunals could not be trusted, were made recoverable in any court of vice admiralty in the colonies. It will be readily conceived how odious a law, made to effect an odious object, must have been rendered by such provisions as these. 1765, the resolution concerning the duties on stamps excited a great and general ferment in America. The right of Parliament to impose taxes on the colonies for the purpose of raising a revenue became the subject of universal conversation, and was almost universally denied. Petitions to the King and memorials to both Houses of Parliament against the measure were transmitted by several of the provincial assemblies to the Board of Trade in England, to be presented to His Majesty immediately, and to Parliament when that body should be convened. The House of Representatives of Massachusetts instructed their agent to use his utmost endeavors to prevent the passage of the Stamp Act, or any other act levying taxes or impositions of any kind on the American provinces. A committee was appointed to act in the recess of the General Court, with instructions to correspond with the legislatures of the several colonies, to communicate to them the instructions given to the agent of Massachusetts, and to solicit their concurrence in similar measures. These legislative proceedings were in many places seconded by associations entered into by individuals for diminishing the use of British manufactures. The administration, perceiving the opposition to be encountered by adhering to the vote of the preceding session, informed the agents of the colonies in London that if they would propose any other mode of raising the sum required, their proposition would be accepted and the stamp duty laid aside. The agents replied that they were not authorized to propose any substitute, but were ordered to oppose the bill when it should be brought into the House, by petitions questioning the right of Parliament to tax the colonies. This reply placed the controversy on ground which admitted of no compromise. Determined to persevere in the system he had adopted, and believing successful resistance to be impossible, Mr. Grenville brought into Parliament his celebrated act for imposing stamp duties in America, and it passed both houses by great majorities, but not without animated debate. So little weight does the human mind allow to the most conclusive arguments, when directed against the existence of power in ourselves, that General Conway is said to have stood alone in denying the right claimed by Parliament. This act excited serious alarm throughout the colonies. It was sincerely believed to wound vitally the Constitution of the country, and to destroy the most sacred principles of liberty. Combinations against its execution were formed, and the utmost exertions were used to diffuse among the people a knowledge of the pernicious consequences which must flow from admitting that the colonists could be taxed by a legislature in which they were not represented. The Assembly of Virginia was in session when the intelligence was received, and by a small majority passed several resolutions introduced by Mr. Henry and seconded by Mr. Johnson, one of which asserts the exclusive right of that assembly to lay taxes and impositions on the inhabitants of that colony. On the passage of these resolutions, the governor dissolved the assembly, and writs for new elections were issued. In almost every instance, the members who had voted in favor of the resolutions were reelected, while those who had voted against them were generally excluded. The legislatures of several other colonies passed resolutions similar to those of Virginia. The House of Representatives of Massachusetts, contemplating a still more solemn and effectual expression of the general sentiment, recommended a Congress of Deputies from all the colonial assemblies to meet at New York the first Monday in October. Circular letters communicating this recommendation were addressed to the respective assemblies wherever they were in session. New Hampshire alone, although concurring in the general opposition, declined sending members to the Congress, and the legislatures of Virginia and North Carolina were not in session. In the meantime, the press teemed with the most animating exhortations to the people to unite in defense of their liberty and property, and the stamp officers were, almost universally, compelled to resign. Congress at New York at the time appointed the commissioners from the assemblies of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. The three lower counties on the Delaware, Maryland, and South Carolina assembled at New York, and having chosen Timothy Ruggles of Massachusetts their chairman, proceeded on the important objects for which they had convened. The first measure of Congress was a declaration of the rights and grievances of the colonists. This paper asserts their title to all the rights and liberties of natural-born subjects within the kingdom of Great Britain, among the most essential of which are the exclusive power to tax themselves and the trial by jury. The act granting certain stamp and other duties in the British colonies was placed first on the list of grievances. Its direct tendency, they said, was, by taxing the colonists without their consent, and by extending the jurisdiction of courts of admiralty to subvert their rights and liberties. They also addressed a petition to the king and a memorial to each House of Parliament. These papers were drawn with temperate firmness. They express unequivocally the attachment of the colonists to the mother country, and assert the rights they claim in the earnest language of conviction. Having, in addition to these measures, recommended to the several colonies to appoint special agents with instructions to unite their utmost endeavors in soliciting a redress of grievances, and directed their clerk to make out a copy of their proceedings for each colony, Congress adjourned. To interest the people of England against the measures of administration, associations were formed for the encouragement of domestic manufactures and against the use of those imported from Great Britain. To increase their quantity of wool, the colonists determined to kill no lambs, and to use all the means in their power to multiply their flocks of sheep. To avoid the use of stamps, proceedings in the courts of justice were suspended, and a settlement of all controversies by arbitration was strongly recommended. Violence in the large towns. While this determined and systematic opposition was made by the thinking part of the community, some riotous and disorderly meetings took place, especially in the large towns, which threatened serious consequences. Many houses were destroyed, much property injured, and several persons, highly respectable in character and station, were grossly abused. While these transactions were passing in America, causes entirely unconnected with the affairs of the colonies produced a total revolution in the British cabinet. The Grenville party was succeeded by an administration unfriendly to the plan for taxing the colonies without their consent. General Conway, one of the principal secretaries of state, addressed a circular letter to the several governors in which he censured in mild terms the violent measures that had been adopted, and recommended to them, while they maintained the dignity of the Crown and of Parliament, to observe a temperate and conciliatory conduct towards the colonies, and to endeavor by persuasive means to restore the public peace. 1766, Parliament was opened by a speech from the throne in which His Majesty declared his firm confidence in their wisdom and zeal, which would, he doubted not, guide them to such sound and prudent resolutions as might tend at once to preserve the constitutional rights of the British legislature over the colonies, and to restore to them that harmony and tranquillity which had lately been interrupted by disorders of the most dangerous nature. In the course of the debate in the House of Commons on the motion of the address, Mr. Pitt, in explicit terms, condemned the act for collecting stamp duties in America, and avowed the opinion that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies. He asserted at the same time the authority of that kingdom to be sovereign and supreme in every circumstance of government and legislation whatever. He maintained the difficult proposition that taxation is no part of the governing or legislative power, but that taxes are a voluntary gift and grant of the Commons alone, and concluded an eloquent speech by recommending to the House that the Stamp Act be repealed absolutely, totally, and immediately. The opinions expressed by Mr. Pitt were warmly opposed by the late ministers. Mr. Grenville said that the disturbances in America were grown to tumults and riots. He doubted they bordered on open rebellion, and if the doctrine he had heard that day should be confirmed, he feared they would lose that name to take that of revolution. The government over them being dissolved, a revolution would take place in America. He contended that taxation was a part of the sovereign power, one branch of legislation, and had been exercised over those who were not represented. He could not comprehend the distinction between external and internal taxation, and insisted that the colonies ought to bear a part of the burdens occasioned by a war for their defense. Stamp Act repealed. The existing administration, however, concurred in sentiment with Mr. Pitt, and the act was repealed, but its repeal was accompanied with a declaratory act asserting the right of Great Britain to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The intelligence of this event was received in America with general manifestations of joy. The assertion of the abstract principle of right gave many but little concern, because they considered it merely as a salve for the wounded pride of the nation, and believed confidently that no future attempt would be made to reduce it to practice. The highest honors were conferred on those parliamentary leaders who had exerted themselves to obtain a repeal of the act, and in Virginia the House of Burgesses voted a statue to His Majesty as an acknowledgment of their high sense of his attention to the rights and petitions of his people. Though all the colonies rejoiced at the repeal of the Stamp Act, the same temper did not prevail in all of them. In the commercial cities of the North, the regulations of trade were nearly as odious as the Stamp Act itself. Political parties, too, had been formed, and had assumed a bitterness in some of the colonies entirely unknown in others. These dispositions were not long concealed. The first measures of Massachusetts and of New York demonstrated that in them the reconciliation with the mother country was not cordial. The letter of Secretary Conway, transmitting the repeal of the act imposing a duty on stamps, enclosed also a resolution of Parliament declaring that those persons who had suffered injuries in consequence of their assisting to execute that act ought to be compensated by the colony in which such injuries were sustained. This was chiefly in Massachusetts. The resolution of Parliament was laid before the General Court of that province by Governor Bernard, in a speech rather in the spirit of the late than the present administration, rather calculated to irritate than assuage the angry passions that had been excited. The House of Representatives resented his manner of addressing them, and appeared more disposed to inquire into the riots and to compel those concerned in them to make indemnities than to compensate the sufferers out of the public purse. But after a second session, and some intimation that Parliament would enforce its requisition, an act of pardon to the offenders and of indemnity to the sufferers was passed, but was rejected by the King, because the Colonial Assembly had no power by their charter to pass an act of general pardon, but at the instance of the Crown. In New York, where General Gage was expected with a considerable body of troops, a message was transmitted by the governor to the legislature desiring their compliance with an act of Parliament called the Mutiny Act, which required that the colony in which any of His Majesty's forces might be stationed should provide barracks for them and necessaries in their quarters. The legislature postponed the consideration of this message until the troops were actually arrived, and then, after a second message from the governor, reluctantly and partially complied with the requisitions of the act. At a subsequent session, the governor brought the subject again before the Assembly, who determined that the act of Parliament could be construed only to require that provision should be made for troops on a march, and not while permanently stationed in the country. The reason assigned for not furnishing the accommodations required by the governor implies the opinion that the act of Parliament was rightfully obligatory, and yet the requisitions of the Mutiny Act were unquestionably a tax, and no essential distinction is perceived between the power of Parliament to levy a tax by its own authority and to levy it through the medium of the colonial legislatures, they having no right to refuse obedience to the act. It is remarkable that such inaccurate ideas should still have prevailed concerning the controlling power of Parliament over the colonies. In England it was thought to manifest a very forbearing spirit that this instance of disobedience was punished with no positive penalties, and that the ministers contented themselves with a law prohibiting the legislature of the province from passing any act until it should comply in every respect with the requisitions of Parliament. The persevering temper of Massachusetts not having found its way to New York, this measure produced the desired effect. 2 companies of artillery, driven into the port of Boston by stress of weather, applied to the governor for supplies. He laid the application before his council, who advised that, in pursuance of the Act of Parliament, the supplies required should be furnished. They were furnished, and the money to procure them was drawn from the Treasury by the authority of the executive. 1767. On the meeting of the legislature, the House of Representatives expressed in pointed terms their disapprobation of the conduct of the governor. Particular umbrage was given by the expression "in pursuance of an Act of Parliament." After the repeal of the Stamp Act, they were surprised to find that this act, equally odious and unconstitutional, should remain in force. They lamented the entry of this reason for the advice of counsel the more, as it was an unwarrantable and unconstitutional step, which totally disabled them from testifying the same cheerfulness they had always shown in granting to his Majesty of their free accord such aids as his service has from time to time required. Copies of these messages were transmitted by Governor Bernard to the minister, accompanied by letters not calculated to diminish the unpleasantness of the communication. The idea of raising revenue in America was so highly favored in England, especially by the landed interests, that not even the influence of administration could have obtained a repeal of the Stamp Act on the naked principle of right. Few were hardy enough to question the supremacy of Parliament, and the act receding from the practical assertion of the power to tax the colonists deeply wounded the pride of the king and of the nation. The temper discovered in some of the colonies was ill calculated to assuage the wound which this measure had inflicted on the haughty spirit of the country, and is supposed to have contributed to the revival of a system which had been reluctantly abandoned. Charles Townshend, Chancellor of the Exchequer, said boastingly in the House of Commons that he knew how to draw a revenue from the colonies without giving them offense. Mr. Grenville eagerly caught at the declaration, and urged this minister to pledge himself to bring forward the measure at which he had hinted. During the sickness and absence of Lord Chatham, the Cabinet had decided on introducing a bill for imposing certain duties on tea, glass, paper, and painters' colours imported into the colonies from Great Britain, and appropriating the money in the first instance to the salaries of the officers of government. This bill was brought into Parliament and passed almost without opposition. The Friends of America in England had distinguished between internal and external taxation, and the same distinction had been made in the colonies, but the discussions originating in the Stamp Act, while they diffused among the colonists a knowledge of their political rights, had inspired also more accurate ideas respecting them. These duties were plainly intended not to regulate commerce, but to raise revenue, which would be as certainly collected from the colonists as the duties on stamps could have been. The principle of these 2 measures was the same. Many of the Americans were too intelligent to be misguided by the distinction between internal and external taxation, or by the precedents quoted in support of the right for which Parliament contended. This measure was considered as establishing a precedent of taxation for the mere purpose of revenue, which might afterwards be extended at the discretion of Parliament, and was spoken of as the entering wedge, designed to make way for impositions too heavy to be borne. The appropriation of the money did not lessen the odium of the tax. The colonists considered the dependence of the officers of government on the colonial legislature for their salaries as the best security for their attending to the interests and cultivating the affections of the provinces. Yet the opinion that this act was unconstitutional was not adopted so immediately or so generally as in the case of the Stamp Act. Many able political essays appeared in the papers, demonstrating that it violated the principles of the English Constitution and of English liberty, before the conviction became general that the same principle which had before been successfully opposed was again approaching in a different form. 1768. The General Court of Massachusetts, perceiving plainly that the claim to tax America was revived, and being determined to oppose it, addressed an elaborate letter to Denis de Beret, agent for the House of Representatives, detailing at great length and with much weight of argument all the objections to the late Acts of Parliament. Letters were also addressed to the Earl of Shelburne and General Conway, Secretaries of State, to the Marquis of Rockingham, Lord Camden, the Earl of Chatham, and the Lords Commissioners of the Treasury. These letters, while they breathe a spirit of ardent attachment to the British Constitution and to the British nation, manifest a perfect conviction that their complaints were just. Conclusive as the arguments they contained might have appeared to Englishmen, if urged by themselves in support of their own rights, they had not much weight when used to disprove the existence of their authority over others. The deep and solemn tone of conviction, however, conveyed in all these letters ought to have produced a certainty that the principles assumed in them had made a strong impression and would not be lightly abandoned. It ought to have been foreseen that with such a people so determined the conflict must be stern and hazardous, and it was well worth the estimate whether the object would compensate the means used to obtain it. Petition to the King. The Assembly also voted a petition to the King, replete with professions of loyalty and attachment, but stating in explicit terms their sense of the acts against which they petitioned. A proposition was next made for an address to the other colonies on the power claimed by Parliament, which after considerable debate was carried in the affirmative, and a circular letter to the assemblies of the several provinces, setting forth the proceedings of the House of Representatives, was prepared and adopted. To rescue their measures from the imputation of systematic opposition to the British government, the House, without acknowledging the obligation of the Mutiny Act, complied with a requisition of the governor to make a farther provision for one of the King's garrisons within the province. The governor soon afterwards prorogued the general court with an angry speech, not calculated to diminish the resentments of the House directed against himself, resentments occasioned as much by the haughtiness of his manners and a persuasion that he had misrepresented their conduct and opinions to ministers, as by the unpopular course his station required him to pursue. The circular letter of the House of Representatives of Massachusetts was well received in the other colonies. They approved the measures which had been taken and readily united in them. They, too, petitioned the King against the obnoxious acts of Parliament and instructed their several agents to use all proper means to obtain their repeal. Virginia transmitted a statement of her proceedings to her sister colonies, and her House of Burgesses, in a letter to Massachusetts, communicating the representation made to Parliament, say that they do not affect an independency of their parent kingdom, the prosperity of which they are bound to the utmost of their abilities to promote, but cheerfully acquiesce in the authority of Parliament to make laws for the preserving a necessary dependence and for regulating the trade of the colonies. Yet they cannot conceive, and humbly insist it is not essential to support a proper relation between the mother country and colonies transplanted from her, that she should have a right to raise money from them without their consent, and presume they do not aspire to more than the right of British subjects when they assert that no power on earth has a right to impose taxes on the people or take the smallest portion of their property without their consent given by their representatives in Parliament. On the first intimation of the measures taken by Massachusetts, the Earl of Hillsborough, who had been appointed to the newly created office of Secretary of State for the Department of the Colonies, addressed a circular to the several governors to be laid before the respective assemblies, in which he treated the circular letter of Massachusetts as being of the most dangerous tendency, calculated to inflame the minds of His Majesty's good subjects in the colonies, to promote an unwarrantable combination, to excite an open opposition to the authority of Parliament, and to subvert the true principles of the Constitution. His first object was to prevail on the several assemblies openly to censure the conduct of Massachusetts, his next to prevent their approving the proceedings of that colony. The letter, far from producing the desired effect, rather served to strengthen the determination of the colonies to unite in their endeavors to obtain a repeal of laws universally detested. On manifesting this disposition, the assemblies were generally dissolved, probably in pursuance of instructions from the Crown. When the General Court of Massachusetts was again convened, Governor Bernard laid before the House of Representatives an extract of a letter from the Earl of Hillsborough, in which, after animadverting in harsh terms on the circular letter to the colonies, he declared it to be the King's pleasure that the Governor should require the House of Representatives, in His Majesty's name, to rescind the resolution on which the circular letter was founded, and to declare their disapprobation of and dissent from that rash and hasty proceeding. This message excited considerable agitation, but the House, without coming to any resolution on it, requested the governor to lay before them the whole letter of the Earl of Hillsborough, and also copies of such letters as had been written by His Excellency to that nobleman on the subject to which the message referred. The copies were haughtily refused, but the residue of the letter from the Earl of Hillsborough was laid before them. That minister said, if notwithstanding the apprehensions which may justly be entertained of the ill consequence of a continuance of this factious spirit, which seems to have influenced the resolutions of the Assembly, at the conclusion of the last session, the new assembly should refuse to comply with his Majesty's reasonable expectation, it is the king's pleasure that you immediately dissolve them. This subject being taken into consideration, a letter to the Earl was reported and agreed to by a majority of 93 to 13, in which they defended their circular letter in strong and manly but respectful terms, and concluded with saying, "The House humbly rely on the royal clemency, that to petition his Majesty will not be deemed by him to be inconsistent with the respect to the British Constitution as settled at the Revolution by William III, and that to acquaint their fellow subjects involved in the same distress of their having so done, in full hopes of success, even if they had invited the union of all America in one joint supplication, would not be discountenanced by their gracious sovereign as a measure of an inflammatory nature. That when your lordship shall in justice lay a true state of these matters before his Majesty, he will no longer consider them as tending to create unwarrantable combinations, or excite an unjustifiable opposition to the constitutional authority of Parliament; that he will then truly discern who are of that desperate faction which is continually disturbing the public tranquillity, and that while his arm is extended for the protection of his distressed and injured subjects, he will frown upon all those who, to gratify their own passions, have dared to attempt to deceive him." Legislature of Massachusetts dissolved. A motion to rescind the resolution on which their circular letter was founded passed in the negative by a majority of 92 to 17, and a letter to the governor was prepared, stating their motives for refusing to comply with the requisition of the Earl of Hillsborough. Immediately after receiving it, he prorogued the assembly with an angry speech, and the next day dissolved it by proclamation. While the opposition was thus conducted by the legislature with temperate firmness and legitimate means, the general irritation occasionally displayed itself at Boston in acts of violence, denoting evidently that the people of that place were prepared for much stronger measures than their representatives had adopted. Seizure of the sloop Liberty. The seizure of the sloop Liberty, belonging to Mr. Hancock, by the collector of the customs, occasioned the assemblage of a tumultuous mob, who beat the officers and their assistants, took possession of a boat belonging to the collector, burnt it in triumph, and patrolled the streets for a considerable time. The revenue officers fled for refuge, first to the Romney man-of-war, and afterwards to Castle William. After the lapse of some time, the governor moved the council to take into consideration some measure for restoring vigor and firmness to government. The council replied that the disorders which happened were occasioned by the violent and unprecedented manner in which the sloop Liberty had been seized by the officers of the customs, and the inhabitants of Boston, in a justificatory memorial, supported by affidavits, insisted that the late tumults were occasioned principally by the haughty conduct of the commissioners and their subordinate officers, and by the illegal and offensive conduct of the Romney man-of-war. The legislature, however, did not think proper to countenance this act of violence. A committee of both houses, appointed to inquire into the state of the province, made a report which, after reprobating the circumstances attending the seizure to which the mob was ascribed, declared their abhorrence of a procedure which they pronounced criminal, desired the governor to direct a prosecution against all persons concerned in the riot, and to issue a proclamation offering a reward to any person who should make discoveries by which the rioters or their abettors should be brought to condign punishment. This report, however, seems to have been intended rather to save appearances than to produce any real effect. It was perfectly understood that no person would dare to inform or even to appear as a witness in any prosecution which might be instituted. Suits were afterwards brought against Mr. Hancock and others, owners of the vessel and cargo, but they were never prosecuted to a final decision. This riot accelerated a measure which tended in no inconsiderable degree to irritate still farther the angry dispositions already prevalent in Boston. The governor had pressed on administration the necessity of stationing a military force in the province for the protection of the officers employed in collecting the revenue and of the magistrates in preserving the public peace. In consequence of these representations, orders had already been given to General Gage to detach at least one regiment on this service, and to select for the command of it an officer on whose prudence, resolution, and integrity he could rely. The transactions respecting the sloop Liberty rendered any attempt to produce a countermand of these orders entirely abortive, and probably occasioned 2 regiments instead of 1 to be detached by General Gage. It seems to have been supposed that a dissolution of the Assembly of Massachusetts would dissolve also the opposition to the measures of administration, and that the people, having no longer constitutional leaders, being no longer excited and conducted by their representatives, would gradually become quiet and return to what was termed their duty to government. But the opinions expressed by the House of Representatives were the opinions of the great body of the people, and had been adopted with too much ardor to be readily suppressed. The most active and energetic part of society had embraced them with enthusiasm, and the dissolution of the Assembly, by creating a necessity for devising other expedients, hastened the mode of conducting opposition at least as efficacious, and afterwards universally adopted. At a town meeting of the inhabitants of Boston, a committee was deputed for the purpose of praying the governor to convene another General Assembly. He replied that no other could be convened until His Majesty's commands to that effect should be received. This answer being reported, the meeting resolved that to levy money within the province by any other authority than that of the General Court was a violation of the royal charter and of the undoubted natural rights of British subjects; that the freeholders and other inhabitants of the town of Boston would, at the peril of their lives and fortunes, take all legal and constitutional measures to defend all and singular the rights, liberties, privileges, and immunities granted in their royal charter; that, as there was an apprehension in the minds of many of an approaching war with France, those inhabitants who were not provided with arms should be requested duly to observe the laws of the province, which required that every freeholder should furnish himself with a complete stand. But the important resolution was that, as the governor did not think proper to call a general court for the redress of their grievances, the town would then make choice of a suitable number of persons to act for them as a committee in a convention to be held at Faneuil Hall in Boston, with such as might be sent to join them from the several towns in the province. These votes were communicated by the selectmen in a circular letter to the other towns in the province, which were requested to concur and to elect committeemen to meet those of Boston in convention. Convention assembles in Boston, and the measure was generally adopted, and a convention met, which was regarded with all the respect that could have been paid to a legitimate assembly. Its moderation, the country in general, though united on the great constitutional question of taxation, was probably not so highly exasperated as the people of Boston, and the convention acted with unexpected moderation. They disclaimed all pretensions to any other character than that of mere individuals, assembled by deputation from the towns, to consult and advise on such measures as might tend to promote the peace of His Majesty's subjects in the province, but without power to pass any acts possessing a coercive quality. They petitioned the governor to assemble a general court, and addressed a letter to the agent of the province in England, stating the character in which they met and the motives which brought them together. After expressing their opinions with temper and firmness on the subjects of general complaint, and recommending patience and order to the people, they dissolved themselves and returned to their respective homes. 2 regiments arrived. The day before the convention rose, the 2 regiments which had been detached by General Gage arrived under convoy in Nantasket Road. The council had rejected an application of the governor to provide quarters for them, because the barracks in the castle were sufficient for their accommodation, and by Act of Parliament the British troops were not to be quartered elsewhere until those barracks were full. General Gage had directed 1 regiment to be stationed in Boston, but on hearing a report that the people were in a state of open revolt, he gave additional orders, which left the whole subject to the discretion of the commanding officer, who was induced by some rash threats of opposing the disembarkation of the troops to land both regiments in that place. The ships took a station which commanded the whole town, and lay with their broadsides towards it, ready to fire should any resistance be attempted. The troops landed under cover of their cannon, and marched into the common with loaded muskets and fixed bayonets, a display of military pomp which was believed by the inhabitants to have been intended for the purpose either of intimidation or of irritation. The selectmen, as well as the council, having refused to provide quarters for the troops, the governor ordered the State House to be opened for their reception, and they took possession of all the apartments in it, except that which was reserved for the council. The people were filled with indignation at seeing the chamber of their representatives crowded with regular soldiers, their councillors surrounded with foreign troops, and their whole city exhibiting the appearance of a garrisoned town. With the difference of manners between the soldiers and the inhabitants, and the strong prejudices reciprocally felt against each other, it is not wonderful that personal broils should frequently occur, and that mutual antipathies should be still farther increased. While these measures were pursuing in America, every session of Parliament was opened with a speech from the king, stating that a disposition to refuse obedience to the laws and to resist the authority of the supreme legislature of the nation still prevailed among his misguided subjects in some of the colonies. In the addresses to the throne, both houses uniformly expressed their abhorrence of the rebellious spirit manifested in the colonies, and their approbation of the measures taken by His Majesty for the restoration of order and good government. To give a more solemn expression to the sense of Parliament on this subject, the two houses entered into joint resolutions condemning the measures pursued by the Americans, and agreed to an address approving the conduct of the Crown, giving assurances of effectual support to such farther measures as might be found necessary to maintain the civil magistrates in a due execution of the laws within the province of Massachusetts Bay, and beseeching His Majesty to direct the governor of that colony to obtain and transmit information of all treasons committed in Massachusetts since the year 1767, with the names of the persons who had been most active in promoting such offenses, that prosecutions might be instituted against them within the realm in pursuance of the statute of the 35th of Henry VIII. 1769, the impression made by these threatening declarations would seem to have been directed particularly against Massachusetts in the hope of deterring the other provinces from involving themselves in her dangers, was far from being favorable to the views of the mother country. The determination to resist the exercise of the authority claimed by Great Britain not only remained unshaken, but was manifested in a still more decided form. Not long after these votes of Parliament, the Assembly of Virginia was convened by Lord Botetourt, a nobleman of conciliating manners, who had lately been appointed governor of that province. The House took the state of the colony into their immediate consideration, resolutions of the House of Burgesses of Virginia, and passed unanimously several resolutions asserting the exclusive right of that assembly to impose taxes on the inhabitants within His Majesty's dominion of Virginia, and their undoubted right to petition for a redress of grievances, and to obtain a concurrence of the other colonies in such petitions; that all persons charged with the commission of any offense within that colony were entitled to a trial before the tribunals of that country according to the fixed and known course of proceeding therein, and that to seize such persons and transport them beyond sea for trial derogated in a high degree from the rights of British subjects, as thereby the inestimable privilege of being tried by a jury from the vicinage, as well as the liberty of summoning and producing witnesses on such trial, will be taken from the party accused. An address to His Majesty was also agreed on, which states in the style of loyalty and real attachment to the Crown the deep conviction of the House of Burgesses of Virginia that the complaints of the colonists were well founded. Assembly dissolved. Intelligence of these proceedings having reached the governor, he suddenly dissolved the Assembly. This measure did not produce the desired effect. The members convened at a private house, and having chosen their speaker, moderator, proceeded to form a non-importing association, which was signed by every person present, and afterwards almost universally throughout the province. From the commencement of the controversy, the opinion seems to have prevailed in all the colonies that the most effectual means of succeeding in the struggle in which they were engaged were those which would interest the merchants and manufacturers of Great Britain in their favor. Under the influence of this opinion, associations had been proposed in Massachusetts as early as May 1765 for the non-importation of goods from that country. The merchants of some of the trading towns in the other colonies, especially those of Philadelphia, refused at that time to concur in a measure which they thought too strong for the existing state of things, and it was laid aside. But in the beginning of August it was resumed in Boston, and the merchants of that place entered into an agreement not to import from Great Britain any articles whatever, except a few of the first necessity, between the 1st of January 1769 and the 1st of January 1770, and not to import tea, glass, paper, or painter's colors until the duties imposed on those articles should be taken off. This agreement was soon afterwards adopted in the town of Salem, the city of New York, and the province of Connecticut, but was not generally entered into through the colonies until the resolutions and address of the two houses of Parliament, which have already been mentioned, seemed to cut off the hope that petitions and memorials alone would effect the object for which they contended. The proceedings of the House of Burgesses of Virginia had been transmitted to the speakers of the several assemblies throughout the continent. The measures against the importation of British goods, in the opinion of the neighboring colonies, the occasion required efficacious measures, and an association similar to that which had been formed by their elder sister was entered into by Maryland and the Carolinas. The inhabitants of Charleston went so far as to break off all connection with Rhode Island and Georgia, which had refused to adopt the non-importation agreement. This vigorous measure was not without its influence, and those provinces soon afterwards entered into the association. In Portsmouth, in New Hampshire, where Governor Wentworth possessed great influence, some repugnance to this measure was also discovered, but being threatened with a suspension of their intercourse with the other colonies, the merchants of that place concurred in the general system. All united in giving effect to this agreement. The utmost exertions were used to improve the manufactures of the country, and the fair sex, laying aside the late fashionable ornaments of England, exulted with patriotic pride in appearing dressed in the produce of their own looms. Committees chosen by the people superintended importations, and the force of public opinion went far to secure the agreement from violation. General Court in Massachusetts, the necessities of government requiring a supply of money, the General Court of Massachusetts was again convened. The members of the former House of Representatives were generally reelected and brought with them the temper which had occasioned their dissolution. Instead of entering on the business for which they were called together, they engaged in a controversy with the governor concerning the removal of the ships of war from the harbor and of the troops from the town of Boston, to which they contended his power as the representative of the Crown was adequate. The governor, ascribing this temper to the influence of the metropolis, adjourned the General Court to Cambridge, but this measure served to increase the existing irritation. The business recommended to them remained unnoticed. Their altercations with the governor continued, and they entered into several warm resolutions enlarging the catalogue of their grievances in terms of greater exasperation than had appeared in the official acts of any legislature on the continent. It is prorogued. Not long after the passage of these resolutions, the House explicitly refused to make the provision required by the Mutiny Act for the troops stationed in Massachusetts, upon which the legislature was prorogued until the 1st of January. The committees appointed to examine the cargoes of vessels arriving from Great Britain continued to execute the trust reposed in them. Votes of censure were passed on such as refused to concur in the association or violated its principles, and the names of the offenders were published as enemies to their country. In some cases, the goods imported in contravention of it were locked up in warehouses, and in some few instances they were re-shipped to Great Britain. Not long after the strong resolutions already noticed had been agreed to by Parliament, while their effect was unfolding itself in every part of the American continent, an important revolution took place in the British cabinet. The Duke of Grafton was placed at the head of a new administration. He supported with great earnestness a proposition to repeal the duties imposed for the purpose of raising revenue in the colonies. But his whole influence was insufficient to carry this measure completely. Administration resolved on a partial repeal of duties. It was deemed indispensable to the maintenance of the legislative supremacy of Great Britain to retain the duty on some one article, and that on tea was reserved while the others were relinquished. Seldom has a wise nation adopted a more ill-judged measure than this. The contest with America was plainly a contest of principle, and had been conducted entirely on principle by both parties. The amount of taxes proposed to be raised was too inconsiderable to interest the people of either country, but the principle was, in the opinion of both, of the utmost magnitude. The measure now proposed, while it encouraged the colonists to hope that their cause was gaining strength in Britain, had no tendency to conciliate them. Circular letter of the Earl of Hillsborough. In pursuance of this resolution of the Cabinet, a circular letter was written by the Earl of Hillsborough to the several governors, informing them that it was the intention of His Majesty's ministers to propose in the next session of Parliament taking off the duties on glass, paper, and painters' colours, in consideration of such duties having been laid contrary to the true spirit of commerce, and assuring them that at no time had they entertained the design to propose to Parliament to lay any further taxes on America for the purpose of raising a revenue. This measure was soon communicated in letters from private individuals in England to their correspondents in Massachusetts. The merchants of Boston, apprehensive that an improper opinion concerning its operation might be formed, resolved that the partial repeal of the duties did not remove the difficulties under which their trade labored, and was only calculated to relieve the manufacturers of Great Britain, and that they would still adhere to their non-importation agreement. The communication of the Earl of Hillsborough to the several governors was laid before the respective assemblies as they convened, in terms implying an intention to renounce the imposition in future of any taxes in America, but this communication seems not to have restored perfect content in any of the colonies. The Virginia legislature was in session on its arrival, and Governor Botetourt laid it before them. Their dissatisfaction with it was manifested by a petition to the king, reasserting the rights previously maintained, and by an association signed by the members as individuals, renewing their non-importation agreement until the duty on tea should be repealed. Yet several causes combined to prevent a rigid observance of these associations. The sacrifice of interest made by the merchants could be continued only under the influence of powerful motives. Suspicions were entertained of each other in the same towns, and committees to superintend the conduct of importers were charged with gross partiality. The different towns, too, watched each other with considerable jealousy, and accusations were reciprocally made of infractions of the association to a great extent. Letters were published purporting to be from England, stating that large orders for goods had been received, and the inconvenience resulting from even a partial interruption of commerce and from the want of those manufactures which the inhabitants had been accustomed to use began to be severely and extensively felt. In Rhode Island and Albany it was determined to import as usual, with the exception of such articles as should be dutiable. On the remonstrances of other commercial places, especially of Boston, these resolutions were changed, and the hope was entertained that the general system on which the colonies relied would still be maintained. New York recedes in part from the non-importation agreement. These hopes were blasted by New York. That city soon manifested a disposition to import as usual, with the exception of those articles only which were subject to a duty. At first the resolution thus to limit the operation of the non-importation agreement was made to depend on its being acceded to by Boston and Philadelphia. These towns refused to depart from the association as originally formed, and strenuously urged their brethren of New York to persevere with them in the glorious struggle. This answer was communicated to the people, and their opinion on the question of rescinding or adhering to was taken in from their respective wards. This determination excited the most lively chagrin in New England and Philadelphia. Their remonstrances against it were, however, ineffectual, and the example was soon followed throughout the colonies. The people of New York alleged, in justification of themselves, that the towns of New England had not observed their engagements fairly, and that the merchants of Albany had been in the practice of receiving goods from Quebec, but no sufficient evidence in support of these assertions was ever produced. 1770, about this time, a circumstance occurred which produced the most serious agitation. The two regiments stationed in Boston to support, as was said, the civil authority and preserve the peace of the town were viewed by the inhabitants with very prejudiced eyes. March, riot in Boston. Frequent quarrels arose between them, and at length an affray took place in the night near the gates of the barracks, which brought out Captain Preston, the officer of the day, with a part of the main guard, between whom and the townsmen blows ensued, on which some of the soldiers fired, and 4 of the people were killed. The alarm bells were immediately rung, the drums beat to arms, and an immense multitude assembled. Inflamed to madness by the view of the dead bodies, they were with difficulty restrained from rushing on the 29th Regiment, which was then drawn up under arms in King Street. The exertions of the lieutenant governor, who promised that the laws should be enforced on the perpetrators of the act, and the efforts of several respectable and popular individuals prevented their proceeding to extremities, and prevailed on them after the regiment had been marched to the barracks to disperse without farther mischief. Captain Preston and the soldiers who had fired were committed to prison for trial. On the next day upwards of 4,000 citizens of Boston assembled at Faneuil Hall, and in a message to the lieutenant governor stated it to be the unanimous opinion of the meeting that the inhabitants and soldiers can no longer live together in safety, that nothing can rationally be expected to restore the peace of the town and prevent farther blood and carnage but the immediate removal of the troops, and they therefore most fervently prayed his honor that his power and influence might be exerted for their instant removal. The lieutenant governor expressed his extreme sorrow at the melancholy event which had occurred, and declared that he had taken measures to have the affair inquired into and justice done, that the military were not under his command, but received their orders from the general at New York, which orders it was not in his power to countermand, that on the application of the council for the removal of the troops, Colonel Dalrymple, their commanding officer, had engaged that the 29th Regiment, which had been concerned in the affair, should be marched to the castle and there placed in barracks until farther orders should be received from the general, and that the main guard should be removed and the 14th Regiment laid under such restraints that all occasions of future disturbance should be prevented. This answer was voted to be unsatisfactory, and a committee was deputed to wait on the lieutenant governor and inform him that nothing could content them but an immediate and total removal of the troops. This vote was laid before the council, by Mr. Hutchinson, who had succeeded Mr. Bernard in the government of the province. The council declared themselves unanimously of opinion that it was absolutely necessary for His Majesty's service, the good order of the town, and the peace of the province, that the troops should be immediately removed out of the town of Boston. This opinion and advice being communicated to Colonel Dalrymple, he gave his honor that measure should be immediately taken for the removal of both regiments. Satisfied with this assurance, the meeting secured the tranquillity of the town by appointing a strong military watch, and immediately dissolved itself. This transaction was very differently related by the different parties. Mr. Gordon, whose history was written when the resentments of the moment had subsided, and who has collected the facts of the case carefully, states it in such a manner as nearly, if not entirely, to exculpate the soldiers. It appears that an attack upon them had been preconcerted, and that, after being long insulted with the grossest language, they were repeatedly assaulted by the mob with balls of ice and snow, and with sticks, before they were induced to fire. Trial of Captain Preston and the soldiers. This representation is strongly supported by the circumstances that Captain Preston, after a long and public trial, was acquitted by a Boston jury, and that 6 of the 8 soldiers who were prosecuted were acquitted, and the remaining 2 found guilty of manslaughter only. Mr. Quincy and Mr. John Adams, 2 eminent lawyers and distinguished leaders of the patriotic party, defended the accused without sustaining any diminution of popularity. Yet this event was very differently understood through the colonies. It was generally believed to be a massacre equally barbarous and unprovoked, and it increased the detestation in which the soldiers were universally held. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14, Part 1 of the Life of Washington, Volume 1 by John Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14, Insurrection in North Carolina, Dissatisfaction of Massachusetts, Corresponding Committees, Governor Hutchinson's Correspondence communicated by Dr. Franklin, the Assembly petition for his removal. He is succeeded by General Gage. Measures to enforce the act concerning duties. Ferment in America. The tea thrown into the sea at Boston. Measures of Parliament. General enthusiasm in America. A General Congress proposed. General Gage arrives. Troops stationed on Boston Neck. New councilors and judges obliged to resign. Boston Neck fortified. Military stores seized by General Gage. Preparations for defense. King's speech. Proceedings of Parliament. Battle of Lexington. Massachusetts raises men. Meeting of Congress. Proceedings of that body. Transactions in Virginia. Provincial Congress of South Carolina. Battle of Breed's Hill. 1770. In the middle and southern colonies, the irritation against the mother country appears to have gradually subsided, and no disposition was manifested to extend opposition farther than to the importation of tea. Insurrection in North Carolina. Their attention was a good deal directed to an insurrection in North Carolina, where a number of ignorant people, supposing themselves to be aggrieved by the fee bill, rose in arms for the purpose of shutting up the courts of justice, destroying all officers of government and all lawyers, and of prostrating government itself. Governor Tryon marched against them, defeated them in a decisive battle, quelled the insurrection, and restored order. Dissatisfaction of Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, where the doctrine that Parliament could not rightfully legislate for the colonies was maintained as a corollary from the proposition that Parliament could not tax them, a gloomy discontent was manifested. That the spirit of opposition seemed to be expiring without securing the rights they claimed, excited apprehensions of a much more serious nature in the bosoms of that inflexible people than the prospect of any conflict, however terrible. This temper displayed itself in all their proceedings. The legislature, which the governor continued to convene at Cambridge, remonstrated against this removal as an intolerable grievance, and for 2 sessions refused to proceed on business. In one of their remonstrances, they asserted the right of the people to appeal to heaven in disputes between them and persons in power, when power shall be abused. Corresponding committees. From the commencement of the contest, Massachusetts had been peculiarly solicitous to unite all the colonies in one system of measures. In pursuance of this favorite idea, a committee of correspondence was elected by the General Court to communicate with such committees as might be appointed by other legislatures. Similar committees were soon afterwards chosen by the towns throughout the province for the purpose of corresponding with each other, and the example was soon followed by other colonies. 1772, while this system of vigilance was in progress, a discovery was made which greatly increased the ill temper of New England. Dr. Franklin, the agent of Massachusetts, by some unknown means, Governor Hutchinson's correspondence, obtained possession of the letters which had been addressed by Governor Hutchinson and by Lieutenant Governor Oliver to the Department of State. He transmitted these letters to the General Court. They were obviously designed to induce government to persevere the system which was alienating the affections of the colonists. The opposition was represented as being confined to a few factious men whose conduct was not generally approved, and who had been emboldened by the weakness of the means used to restrain them. More vigorous measures were recommended, and several specific propositions were made which were peculiarly offensive. Among these was a plan for altering the charters of the colonies and rendering the high officers dependent solely on the Crown for their salaries. 1773, petition for the removal of the governor and lieutenant governor. The Assembly, inflamed by these letters, unanimously resolved that their tendency and design were to overthrow the constitution of the government and to introduce arbitrary power into the province. At the same time, a petition to the king was voted, praying him to remove Governor Hutchinson and Lieutenant Governor Oliver forever from the government of the colony. This petition was transmitted to Dr. Franklin and laid before the king in council. After hearing it, the lords of the council reported that the petition in question was founded upon false and erroneous allegations, and that the same is groundless, vexatious, and scandalous, and calculated only for the seditious purposes of keeping up a spirit of clamor and discontent in the provinces. This report His Majesty was pleased to approve. Hutchinson succeeded by Gage. Governor Hutchinson, however, was soon afterwards removed, and General Gage appointed to succeed him. The fears of Massachusetts that the spirit which had been roused in the colonies might gradually subside were not of long continuance. The determination not to import tea from England had so lessened the demand for that article that a considerable quantity had accumulated in the magazines of the East India Company. They urged the minister to take off the import American duty of 3 pence per pound, and offered in lieu of it to pay double that sum on exportation. Measures to enforce the duty, 1774. Instead of acceding to this proposition, drawbacks were allowed on tea exported to the colonies, and the export duty on that article was taken off. These encouragements induced the company to make shipments on their own account, and large quantities were consigned to agents in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, and other principal places on the continent. The crisis was arrived, and the conduct of the colonies was now to determine whether they would submit to be taxed by Parliament or meet the consequences of a practical assertion of the opinions they had maintained. The tea, if landed, would be sold, the duties would consequently be paid, and the precedent for taxing them established. The same sentiment on this subject appears to have pervaded the whole continent at the same time. This ministerial plan of importation was considered by all as a direct attack on the liberties of the people of America, which it was the duty of all to oppose. Ferment in America. A violent ferment was excited in all the colonies. The corresponding committees were extremely active, and it was almost universally declared that whoever should directly or indirectly countenance this dangerous invasion of their rights was an enemy to his country. The consignees were generally compelled to relinquish their consignments, and in most instances the ships bringing the tea were obliged to return with it. At Boston, a town meeting appointed a committee to wait on the consignees to request their resignation. This request not being complied with, another large meeting assembled at Faneuil Hall, who voted with acclamation that the tea shall not be landed, that no duty shall be paid, and that it shall be sent back in the same bottoms. With a foreboding of the probable consequences of the measure about to be adopted, and a wish that those consequences should be seriously contemplated, a leading member thus addressed the meeting. It is not, Mr. Moderator, the spirit that vapors within these walls that must stand us instead. The exertions of this day will call forth events which will make a very different spirit necessary for our salvation. Whoever supposes that shouts and hosannas will terminate the trials of the day entertains a childish fancy. We must be grossly ignorant of the importance and value of the prize for which we contend. We must be equally ignorant of the power of those who have combined against us. We must be blind to that malice, inveteracy, and insatiable revenge which actuate our enemies, public and private, abroad and in our bosoms,
to hope that we shall end this controversy without the sharpest conflicts, to flatter ourselves that popular resolves, popular harangues, popular acclamations, and popular vapor will vanquish our foes. Let us consider the issue. Let us look to the end. Let us weigh and consider before we advance to those measures which must bring on the most trying and terrible struggle this country ever saw. The question was again put and passed unanimously in the affirmative. The captain of the vessel, aware of the approaching danger, was desirous of returning, and applied to the governor for a clearance. Affecting a rigid regard to the letter of his duty, he declined giving one unless the vessel should be properly qualified at the custom house. This answer being reported, the meeting was declared to be dissolved, and an immense crowd repaired to the quay, tea thrown into the sea, where a number of the most resolute, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded the vessel, broke open 342 chests of tea, and discharged their contents into the ocean. Measures of Parliament. These proceedings were laid before Parliament in a message from the Crown, and excited a high and general indignation against the colonies. Both houses expressed almost unanimously their approbation of the measures adopted by His Majesty, and gave explicit assurances that they would exert every means in their power to provide effectually for the due execution of the laws, and to secure the dependence of the colonies upon the Crown and Parliament of Great Britain. The temper both of the Parliament and of the nation was entirely favorable to the high-handed system of coercion proposed by ministers, and that temper was not permitted to pass away unemployed. A bill was brought in for discontinuing the lading and shipping of goods, wares, and merchandises at Boston or the harbor thereof, and for the removal of the custom house with its dependencies to the town of Salem. This bill was to continue in force not only until compensation should be made to the East India Company for the damage sustained, but until the King in Council should declare himself satisfied as to the restoration of peace and good order in Boston. It passed both houses without a division and almost without opposition. The Boston Tea Party, from the painting by Robert Reed in the Massachusetts State House. In this picture, a leading modern American artist has succeeded admirably in depicting the band of Boston citizens who, disguised as Indians, boarded 3 British ships in Boston harbor, December 16, 1773, and threw their cargoes of tea overboard, in defying England to impose on the American colonies a tax on tea for the benefit of the straitened East India Company. 342 chests, valued at about £18,000, were destroyed in this manner without a sound from a great mob of onlookers thronging the wharves. The mob dispersed quietly as soon as the last chest went overboard. Soon afterwards a bill was brought in for better regulating the government of the province of Massachusetts Bay. This act entirely subverted the charter and vested in the Crown the appointment of the councilors, magistrates, and other officers of the colony, who were to hold their offices during the royal pleasure. This bill also was carried through both houses by great majorities, but not without a vigorous opposition and an animated debate. The next measure proposed was a bill for the impartial administration of justice in the province of Massachusetts Bay. It provided that in case any person should be indicted in that province for murder or any other capital offense, and it should appear by information given on oath to the governor that the fact was committed in the exercise or aid of magistracy in suppressing riots, and that a fair trial could not be had in the province, he should send the person so indicted to any other colony or to Great Britain to be tried. This act was to continue in force for 4 years. A bill was also passed for quartering soldiers on the inhabitants, and the system was completed by an act making more effectual provision for the government of the province of Quebec. This bill extended the boundaries of that province so as to comprehend the territory between the lakes, the Ohio, and the Mississippi, and established a legislative council to be appointed by the Crown for its government. Amidst these hostile measures, one single conciliatory proposition was made. Mr. Rose Fuller moved that the House resolve itself into a committee to take into consideration the duty on the importation of tea into America with a view to its repeal. This motion was seconded by Mr. Burke and supported with all the power of reasoning and all the splendor of eloquence which distinguished that consummate statesman, but reason and eloquence were of no avail. It was lost by a great majority. The Earl of Chatham, who had long been too ill to attend Parliament, again made his appearance in the House of Lords. He could have been drawn out only by a strong sense of the fatal importance of those measures into which the nation was hurrying. But his efforts were unavailing. Neither his weight of character, his sound judgment, nor his manly eloquence could arrest the hand of fate which seemed to propel this lofty nation with irresistible force to measures which terminated in its dismemberment. It was expected, and this expectation was encouraged by Mr. Hutchinson, that by directing these measures particularly against Boston, not only the union of the colonies would be broken, but Massachusetts herself would be divided. Never was expectation more completely disappointed. All perceived that Boston was to be punished for having resisted, only with more violence, the principle which they had all resisted, and that the object of the punishment was to coerce obedience to a principle they were still determined to resist. They felt, therefore, that the cause of Boston was the cause of all, that their destinies were indissolubly connected with those of that devoted town, and that they must submit to be taxed by a parliament in which they were not and could not be represented, or support their brethren who were selected to sustain the first shock of a power which, if successful there, would overwhelm them all. The neighboring towns, disdaining to avail themselves of the calamities inflicted on a sister for her exertions in the common cause, clung to her with increased affection, general enthusiasm, and that spirit of enthusiastic patriotism which for a time elevates the mind above all considerations of individual acquisition, became the ruling passion in the American bosom. On receiving intelligence of the Boston Port Bill, a meeting of the people of that town was called. They perceived that the sharpest conflict was indeed approaching, but were not dismayed by its terrors. Far from seeking to shelter themselves from the threatening storm by submission, they grew more determined as it increased. Resolutions were passed expressing their opinion of the impolicy, injustice, inhumanity, and cruelty of the act, from which they appealed to God and to the world, and also inviting the other colonies to join with them in an agreement to stop all imports and exports to and from Great Britain, Ireland, and the West Indies until the act should be repealed. It was not in Boston only that this spirit was roused. Addresses were received from every part of the continent, expressing sentiments of sympathy in their afflictions, exhorting them to resolution and perseverance, assuring them that they were considered as suffering in the common cause. The legislature of Virginia was in session when intelligence of the Boston Port Bill reached that province. The House of Burgesses set apart the 1st of June, the day on which the bill was to go into operation, for fasting, prayer, and humiliation, to implore the divine interposition to avert the heavy calamity which threatened the destruction of their civil rights, the evils of a civil war, and to give one heart and one mind to the people, firmly to oppose every invasion of their liberties. Similar resolutions were adopted in almost every province, and the 1st of June became, throughout the colonies, a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, in the course of which sermons were preached to the people, well calculated to inspire them with horror against the authors of the unjust sufferings of their fellow subjects in Boston. This measure occasioned the dissolution of the Assembly. The members, before separation, entered into an association in which they declared that an attack on one colony to compel submission to arbitrary taxes is an attack on all British America, and threatens ruin to the rights of all unless the united wisdom of the whole be applied in prevention. A general congress proposed. They therefore recommended to the Committee of Correspondence to communicate with the several committees of the other provinces on the expediency of appointing deputies from the different colonies to meet annually in Congress and to deliberate on the common interests of America. This measure had already been proposed in town meetings, both in New York and Boston. General Gage arrives in Boston. While the people of Boston were engaged in the first consultations respecting the bill, directed particularly against themselves, General Gage arrived in town. He was received, notwithstanding the deep gloom of the moment, with those external marks of respect which had been usual and which were supposed to belong to his station. The General Court, convened by the governor at Salem, passed resolutions declaring the expediency of a meeting of committees from the several colonies, and appointed 5 gentlemen as a committee on the part of Massachusetts. The colonies from New Hampshire to South Carolina inclusive adopted this measure, and where the legislatures were not in session, elections were made by the people. The legislature of Massachusetts also passed declaratory resolutions expressing their opinion on the state of public affairs and recommending to the inhabitants of that province to renounce totally the consumption of East India teas and to discontinue the use of all goods imported from the East Indies and Great Britain until the grievances of America should be completely redressed. The governor, having obtained intelligence of the manner in which the House was employed, sent his secretary with directions to dissolve the Assembly. Finding the doors shut and being refused admittance, he read the order of dissolution aloud on the staircase. The next day the governor received an address from the principal inhabitants of Salem, at that time the metropolis of the province, which marks the deep impression made by a sense of common danger. No longer considering themselves as the inhabitants of Salem, but as Americans, and spurning advantages to be derived to themselves from the distress inflicted on a sister town for its zeal in a cause common to all, they expressed their deep affliction for the calamities of Boston. About this time, rough drafts of the two remaining bills relative to the province of Massachusetts, as well as of that for quartering troops in America, were received in Boston and circulated through the continent. They served to confirm the wavering, to render the moderate indignant, and to inflame the violent. An agreement was framed by the Committee of Correspondence in Boston, entitled A Solemn League and Covenant, whereby the subscribers bound themselves in the presence of God to suspend all commercial intercourse with Great Britain from the last day of the ensuing month of August until the Boston Port Bill and the other late obnoxious laws should be repealed. They also bound themselves in the same manner not to consume or purchase from any goods whatever which should arrive after the specified time, and to break off all dealings with the purchasers as well as with the importers of such goods. They renounced also all intercourse in connection with those who should refuse to subscribe to that covenant, or to bind themselves by some similar agreement, and annex to the renunciation of intercourse the dangerous penalty of publishing to the world the names of all who refuse to give this evidence of attachment to the rights of their country. General Gage issued a proclamation in which he termed this covenant an unlawful, hostile, and traitorous combination, contrary to the allegiance due to the King, destructive of the legal authority of Parliament, and of the peace, good order, and safety of the community. All persons were warned against incurring the pains and penalties due to such dangerous offenses, and all magistrates were charged to apprehend and secure for trial such as should be guilty of them. But the time when the proclamation of governors could command attention had passed away, and the penalties in the power of the Committee of Correspondence were much more dreaded than those which could be inflicted by the civil magistrate. Resolutions were passed in every colony in which legislatures were convened, or delegates assembled in convention, manifesting different degrees of resentment, but concurring in the same great principles. All declared that the cause of Boston was the cause of British America, that the late acts respecting that devoted town were tyrannical and unconstitutional, that the opposition to this ministerial system of oppression ought to be universally and perseveringly maintained, that all intercourse with the parent state ought to be suspended, and domestic manufactures encouraged, and that a general Congress should be formed for the purpose of uniting and guiding the counsels and directing the efforts of North America. The committees of correspondence selected Philadelphia for the place and the beginning of September as the time for the meeting of this important council. Congress assembles. On the 4th of September, the delegates from 11 provinces appeared at the place appointed, and the next day they assembled at Carpenter's Hall, when Peyton Randolph, the late Speaker of the House of Burgesses of Virginia, was unanimously chosen president. The respective credentials of the members were then read and approved, and this august assembly, having determined that each colony should have only one vote, that their deliberations should be conducted with closed doors, and that their proceedings, except such as they might determine to publish, should be kept inviolably secret, entered on the solemn and important duties assigned to them. Committees were appointed to state the rights claimed by the colonies which had been infringed by acts of Parliament passed since the year 1763, to prepare a petition to the King and addresses to the people of Great Britain, to the inhabitants of the province of Quebec, and to the 12 colonies represented in Congress. Certain resolutions of the county of Suffolk and Massachusetts having been taken into consideration, it was unanimously resolved that this assembly deeply feels the suffering of their countrymen in Massachusetts Bay under the operation of the late unjust, cruel, and oppressive acts of the British Parliament, that they most thoroughly approve the wisdom and fortitude with which opposition to these wicked ministerial measures has hitherto been conducted, and they earnestly recommend to their brethren a perseverance in the same firm and temperate conduct as expressed in the resolutions determined upon at a meeting of the delegates for the county of Suffolk on Tuesday the 6th instant, trusting that the effect of the united efforts of North America in their behalf will carry such conviction to the British nation of the unwise, unjust, and ruinous policy of the present administration as quickly to introduce better men and wiser measures. It was resolved unanimously that contributions from all the colonies for supplying the necessities and alleviating the distresses of our brethren in Boston ought to be continued in such manner and so long as their occasions may require. The merchants of the several colonies were requested not to send to Great Britain any orders for goods, and to direct the execution of those already sent to be suspended until the sense of Congress on the means to be taken for preserving the liberties of America be made public. In a few days resolutions were passed suspending the importation of goods from Great Britain or Ireland or any of their dependencies and of their manufactures from any place whatever after the first day of the succeeding December, and against the purchase or use of such goods. It was also determined that all exports to Great Britain, Ireland, and the West Indies should cease on the 10th of September, 1775, lest American grievances should be redressed before that time. An association corresponding with these resolutions was then framed and signed by every member present. Never were laws more faithfully observed than were these resolutions of Congress, and their association was of consequence universally adopted. Early in this session, a Declaration of Rights was made in the shape of resolutions. This paper merits particular attention because it states precisely the ground then taken by America. It is observable that it asserted rights which were not generally maintained at the commencement of the contest, but the exclusive right of legislation in the colonial assemblies, with the exception of acts of the British Parliament bona fide made to regulate external commerce, was not averred unanimously. The addresses prepared, the various papers drawn up, and the measures recommended by this Congress formed the best eulogy of the members who composed it. Affection to the mother country, an exalted admiration of her national character, unwillingness to separate from her, a knowledge of the hazards and difficulties of the approaching contest, mingled with enthusiastic patriotism and a conviction that all which can make life valuable was at stake, characterized their proceedings. Address to the people of Great Britain. When, they say in the address to the people of Great Britain, a nation led to greatness by the hand of liberty, and possessed of all the glory that heroism, munificence, and humanity can bestow, descends to the ungrateful task of forging chains for her friends and children, and instead of giving support to freedom, turns advocate for slavery and oppression, there is reason to suspect that she has either ceased to be virtuous or been extremely negligent in the appointment of her rulers. In almost every age, in repeated conflicts in long and bloody wars, as well civil as foreign, against many and powerful nations, against the open assaults of enemies and the more dangerous treachery of friends, have the inhabitants of your island, your great and glorious ancestors, maintained their independence and transmitted the rights of men and the blessings of liberty to you, their posterity. Be not surprised, therefore, that we who are descended from the same common ancestors, that we whose forefathers participated in all the rights, the liberties, and the Constitution you so justly boast of, and who have carefully conveyed the same fair inheritance to us, guaranteed by the plighted faith of government and the most solemn compacts with British sovereigns, should refuse to surrender them to men who found their claims on no principles of reason, and who prosecute them with a design that by having our lives and property in their power, they may with the greater facility enslave you. After stating the serious condition of American affairs and the oppressions and misrepresentations of their conduct which had induced the address, and their claim to be as free as their fellow subjects in Britain, they say, are not the proprietors of the soil of Great Britain lords of their own property? Can it be taken from them without their consent? Will they yield it to the arbitrary disposal of any men or number of men whatever? You know they will not. Why then are the proprietors of the soil of America less lords of their property than you are of yours? And why should they submit it to the disposal of your Parliament or any other Parliament or Council in the world, not of their election? Can the intervention of the sea that divides us cause disparity of rights, or can any reason be given why English subjects who live 3,000 miles from the royal palace should enjoy less liberty than those who are 300 miles distant from it? Reason looks with indignation on such distinctions, and free men can never perceive their propriety. After expatiating on the resources which the conquest of America would place in the hands of the Crown for the subjugation of Britain, the address proceeds, "We believe there is yet much virtue, much justice, and much public spirit in the English nation. To that justice we now appeal. You have been told that we are seditious, impatient of government, and desirous of independency. Be assured that these are not facts, but calumnies. Permit us to be as free as yourselves, and we shall ever esteem a union with you to be our greatest glory and our greatest happiness. We shall ever be ready to contribute all in our power to the welfare of the empire. We shall consider your enemies as our enemies, and your interest as our own. But if you are determined that your ministers shall wantonly sport with the rights of mankind, if neither the voice of justice, the dictates of the law, the principles of the Constitution, nor the suggestions of humanity can restrain your hands from shedding human blood in such an impious cause, we must then tell you that we will never submit to be hewers of wood or drawers of water for any ministry or nation in the world. Place us in the same situation that we were at the close of the late war, and our former harmony will be restored. Petition to the King. The petition to the King states succinctly the grievances complained of, and then proceeds to say, had our Creator been pleased to give us existence in a land of slavery, the sense of our condition might have been mitigated by ignorance and habit. But thanks be to His adorable goodness, we were born the heirs of freedom, and ever enjoyed our right under the auspices of your royal ancestors, whose family was seated on the British throne to rescue and secure a pious and gallant nation from the popery and despotism of a superstitious and inexorable tyrant. Your Majesty, we are confident, justly rejoices that your title to the crown is thus founded on the title of your people to liberty, and therefore we doubt not but your royal wisdom must approve the sensibility that teaches your subjects anxiously to guard the blessing they receive from divine providence, and thereby to prove the performance of that compact which elevated the illustrious House of Brunswick to the imperial dignity it now possesses. The apprehensions of being degraded into a state of servitude from the preeminent rank of English freemen, while our minds retain the strongest love of liberty, and clearly foresee the miseries preparing for us and for our posterity, excites emotions in our breasts, which, though we cannot describe, we should not wish to conceal. Feeling as men, and thinking as subjects, in the manner we do, silence would be disloyalty. By giving this faithful information, we do all in our power to promote the great objects of your royal cares, the tranquillity of your government, and the welfare of your people. Duty to your Majesty and regard for the preservation of ourselves and our posterity, the primary obligations of nature and society, command us to entreat your royal attention, and as your Majesty enjoys the signal distinction of reigning over free men, we apprehend the language of freemen cannot be displeasing. Your royal indignation, we hope, will rather fall on those designing and dangerous men who, daringly interposing themselves between your royal person and your faithful subjects, and for several years past incessantly employed it to dissolve the bonds of society, by abusing your Majesty's authority, misrepresenting your American subjects, and prosecuting the most desperate and irritating projects of oppression, have at length compelled us, by the force of accumulated injuries too severe to be any longer tolerable, to disturb your Majesty's repose by our complaints. These sentiments are extorted from hearts that much more willingly would bleed in your Majesty's service, yet so greatly have we been misrepresented, that a necessity has been alleged of taking our property from us without our consent, to defray the charge of the administration of justice, the support of civil government, and the defense, protection, and security of the colonies. After assuring His Majesty of the untruth of these allegations, they say, yielding to no British subjects in affectionate attachment to your Majesty's person, family, and government, we too dearly prize the privilege of expressing that attachment by those proofs that are honorable to the prince that receives them, and to the people who give them, ever to resign it to any body of men upon earth. We ask but for peace, liberty, and safety. We wish not a diminution of the prerogative, nor do we solicit the grant of any new right in our favor. Your royal authority over us and our connection with Great Britain we shall always carefully and zealously endeavor to support and maintain. After restating in a very affecting manner the most essential grievances of which they complain, and professing that their future conduct, if their apprehension should be removed, would prove them worthy of the regard they had been accustomed in their happier days to enjoy, they add, permit us then, most gracious Sovereign, in the name of all your faithful people in America, with the utmost humility to implore you, for the honor of Almighty God, whose pure religion our enemies are undermining, for your glory, which can be advanced only by rendering your subjects happy and keeping them united, for the interest of your family, depending on an adherence to the principles that enthroned it, for the safety and welfare of your kingdom and dominions, threatened with almost unavoidable dangers and distresses, that your Majesty, as the loving Father of your whole people, connected by the same bonds of law, loyalty, faith, and blood, though dwelling in various countries, will not suffer the transcendent relation formed by these ties to be farther violated, in uncertain expectation of effects that, if attained, never can compensate for the calamities through which they must be gained. Addressed to the American people, the address to their constituents is replete with serious and temperate argument. In this paper, the several causes which had led to the existing state of things were detailed more at large, and much labor was used to convince their judgments that their liberties must be destroyed and the security of their property and persons annihilated by submission to the pretensions of Great Britain. The first object of Congress being to unite the people of America by demonstrating the sincerity with which their leaders had sought for reconciliation on terms compatible with liberty, great earnestness was used in proving that the conduct of the colonists had been uniformly moderate and blameless. After declaring their confidence in the efficacy of the mode of commercial resistance which had been recommended, the address concludes with saying, "Your own salvation and that of your posterity now depends upon yourselves. You have already shown that you entertain a proper sense of the blessings you are striving to retain. Against the temporary inconveniences you may suffer from a stoppage of trade, you will weigh in the opposite balance the endless miseries you and your descendants must endure from an established arbitrary power. You will not forget the honor of your country that must, from your behavior, take its title in the estimation of the world to glory or to shame, and you will, with the deepest attention, reflect that if the peaceable mode of opposition recommended by us be broken and rendered ineffectual, as your cruel and haughty ministerial enemies, from a contemptuous opinion of your firmness, insolently predict will be the case, you must inevitably be reduced to choose either a more dangerous contest or a final ruinous and infamous submission. Motives thus cogent, arising from the emergency of your unhappy condition, must excite your utmost diligence and zeal to give all possible strength and energy to the pacific measures calculated for your relief. But we think ourselves bound in duty to observe to you that the schemes agitated against the colonies have been so conducted as to render it prudent that you should extend your views to mournful events and be in all respects prepared for every contingency. Above all things, we earnestly entreat you, with devotion of spirit, penitence of heart, and amendment of life, to humble yourselves and implore the favor of Almighty God, and we fervently beseech the divine goodness to take you into his gracious protection." The letter to the people of Canada required no inconsiderable degree of address. The extent of that province was not so alarming to its inhabitants as to their neighbors, and it was not easy to persuade the French settlers, who were far the most numerous, that the establishment of their religion and the partial toleration of their ancient jurisprudence were acts of oppression which ought to be resisted. This delicate subject was managed with considerable dexterity, and the prejudices of the Canadians were assailed with some success. Letters were also addressed to the colonies of St. John's, Nova Scotia, Georgia, and the Floridas, inviting them to unite with their brethren in a cause common to all British America. After completing the business before them and recommending that another Congress should be held at the same place on the 10th of the succeeding May, the House dissolved itself. October. The proceedings of Congress were read throughout America with enthusiastic admiration. The recommendations were revered as revelations and obeyed as laws of the strongest obligation. Absolute unanimity could not be expected to exist, but seldom has a whole people been more united, and never did a more sincere and perfect conviction of the justice of a cause animate the human bosom than was felt by the great body of the Americans. The people generally made great exertions to arm and discipline themselves. Independent companies of gentlemen were formed in all the colonies, and the whole face of the country exhibited the aspect of approaching war. Yet the measures of Congress demonstrate that although resistance by force was contemplated as a possible event, the hope was fondly cherished that the non-importation of British goods would induce a repeal of the late odious acts. It is impossible to account for the non-importation agreement itself. Had war been considered as inevitable, every principle of sound policy required that imports should be encouraged and the largest possible stock of supplies for an army be obtained. New councilors and judges. With the laws relative to the province, Governor Gage received a list of 32 new councilors, a sufficient number of whom to carry on the business of the government accepted the office and entered on its duties. All those who accepted offices under the new system were denounced as enemies to their country. The new judges were unable to proceed in the administration of justice. When the courthouses were opened, the people crowded into them in such numbers that the judges could not obtain admittance, and on being ordered by the officers to make way for the court, they answered that they knew no court independent of the ancient laws and usages of their country, and to no other would they submit. Obliged to resign, the houses of the new councilors were surrounded by great bodies of people, whose threats announced to them that they must resign their offices or be exposed to the fury of an enraged populace. The first part of the alternative was generally embraced. Boston Neck fortified. In this irritable state of the public mind and critical situation of public affairs, it was to be expected that every day would furnish new matter of discontent and jealousy. General Gage deemed it a necessary measure of security to fortify Boston Neck, and this circumstance induced the inhabitants to contemplate seriously an evacuation of the town and removal into the country. Congress was consulted on this proposition, but was deterred from recommending it by the difficulties attending the measure. It was, however, referred to the Provincial Congress with the declaration that if the removal should be deemed necessary, the expense attending it ought to be borne by all the colonies. Military stores seized by General Gage. The fortification of Boston Neck was followed by a measure which excited still greater alarm. The time for the general muster of the militia approached. Under real or pretended apprehensions from their violence, the ammunition and stores which were lodged in the provincial arsenal at Cambridge, and the powder in the magazines at Charlestown, and some other places which was partly private and partly provincial property, were seized by order of the governor and conveyed to Boston. Under the ferment excited by this measure, the people assembled in great numbers and were with difficulty dissuaded from marching to Boston and demanding a redelivery of the stores. Not long afterwards, the fort at Portsmouth in New Hampshire was stormed by an armed body of provincials, and the powder it contained was transported to a place of safety. A similar measure was adopted in Rhode Island. About the same time, a report reached Connecticut that the ships and troops had attacked Boston and were actually firing on the town. Several thousand men immediately assembled in arms and marched with great expedition a considerable distance before they were undeceived. It was in the midst of these ferments, and while these indications of an opinion that hostilities might be expected daily were multiplying on every side, that the people of Suffolk assembled in convention and passed the resolutions already mentioned, which in boldness surpassed any that had been adopted. Provincial Congress in Massachusetts, before the general agitation had risen to its present alarming height, Governor Gage had issued writs for the election of members to a general assembly. These writs were afterwards countermanded by proclamation, but the proclamation was disregarded. The elections were held, and the delegates who assembled and voted themselves a provincial congress conducted the affairs of the colony as if they had been regularly invested with all the powers of government, and their recommendations were respected as sacred laws. Prepares for defense. They drew up a plan for the defense of the province, provided magazines, ammunition, and prepares stores for 12,000 militia, and enrolled a number of minutemen, a term designating a select part of the militia who engaged to appear in arms at a minute's warning. On the approach of winter, the general had ordered temporary barracks to be erected for the troops, partly for their security and partly to prevent the disorders which would unavoidably result from quartering them in the town. Such, however, was the detestation in which they were held, that the select men and committees obliged the workmen to desist from the work, although they were paid for their labor by the Crown, and although employment could at that time be seldom obtained. He was not much more successful in his endeavors to obtain carpenters in New York, and it was with considerable difficulty that these temporary lodgments could be erected. The agency for purchasing winter covering for the troops was offered to almost every merchant in New York, but such was the danger of engaging in this odious employment that not only those who were attached to the party resisting the views of administration, but those also who were in secret friendly to those views refused undertaking it, and declared that they never would supply any article for the benefit of men who were sent as enemies to their country. King's speech to Parliament. In Great Britain a new Parliament was assembled, and the King in his opening speech informed them that a most daring spirit of resistance and disobedience still prevailed in Massachusetts, and had broken forth in fresh violences of a very criminal nature, that the most proper and effectual measures had been taken to prevent these mischiefs, and that they might depend upon a firm resolution to withstand every attempt to weaken or impair the supreme authority of this legislature over all the dominions of the Crown. Proceedings of that body. The addresses re-echoed the sentiments of the speech, all amendments to which were rejected in both houses by considerable majorities, yet the business respecting America was not promptly introduced. Administration seems to have hesitated on the course to be adopted, and the cabinet is said to have been divided respecting future measures. 1775. The few friends of conciliation availed themselves of this delay to bring forward propositions which might restore harmony to the empire. Lord Chatham was not yet dead. This splendid orb, to use the bold metaphor of Mr. Burke, was not yet entirely set. The western horizon was still in a blaze with his descending glory, and the evening of a life which had exhibited one bright, uncheckered course of elevated patriotism was devoted to the service of that country whose aggrandizement seemed to have swallowed up every other passion of his soul. Taking a prophetic view of the future, he demonstrated the impossibility of subjugating America, and urged with all the powers of his vast mind the immediate removal of the troops from Boston as a measure indispensably necessary to open the way for an adjustment of the existing differences with the colonies. Not discouraged by the great majority against this motion, he brought forward a bill for settling the troubles in America, which was rejected by 61 to 32 voices. The day after the rejection of this bill, Lord North moved in the House of Commons an address to His Majesty, declaring that from a serious consideration of the American papers, they find a rebellion actually exists in the province of Massachusetts Bay. In the course of the debate on this address, several professional gentlemen spoke with the utmost contempt of the military character of the Americans, and General Grant, who ought to have known better, declared that at the head of 5 regiments of infantry he would undertake to traverse the whole country and drive the inhabitants from one end of the continent to the other. The address was carried by 288 to 106, and on a conference the House of Lords agreed to join in it. Lord North soon after moved a bill for restraining the trade and commerce of the New England provinces and prohibiting them from carrying on the fisheries on the banks of Newfoundland. While this bill was pending and only vengeance was breathed by the majority, his lordship, to the astonishment of all, suddenly moved what he termed his conciliatory proposition. Its amount was that Parliament would forbear to tax any colony which should tax itself in such a sum as would be perfectly satisfactory. Apparent as it must have been that this proposition would not be accepted in America, it was received with indignation by the majority of the House, and ministers found some difficulty in showing that it was in maintenance of the right to tax the colonies. Before it could be adopted, Lord North condescended to make the dangerous and not very reputable acknowledgment that it was a proposition designed to divide America and to unite Great Britain. It was transmitted to the governors of the several colonies in a circular letter from Lord Dartmouth, with directions to use their utmost influence to prevail on the legislatures to accede to the proposed compromise. These endeavors were not successful. The colonists were universally impressed with too strong a conviction of the importance of union, and understood too well the real principle of the contest to suffer themselves to be divided or deceived by a proposition conciliatory only in name. After the passage of the bill for restraining the trade of New England, information was received that the inhabitants of the middle and southern colonies were supporting their northern brethren in every measure of opposition. In consequence of this intelligence, a second bill was passed for imposing similar restrictions on East and West Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, South Carolina, and the counties on the Delaware. The favorite colonies of New York and North Carolina were omitted as being less disaffected than the others. Fortunately, some time afterwards, the House of Commons refused to hear a petition from the legislature of New York, which alone had declined acceding to the resolutions of Congress on the suggestion of the minister that it contained claims incompatible with the supremacy of Parliament. This haughty rejection had some tendency to convince the advocates of milder measures that had been adopted in their sister colonies that there was no medium between resistance and absolute submission. The King's speech and the proceedings of Parliament served only to convince the leaders of opposition in America that they must indeed prepare to meet mournful events. They had flattered themselves that the union of the colonies, the petition of Congress to the King, and the address to the people of Great Britain would produce happy effects. But these measures removed the delusion. The Provincial Congress of Massachusetts published a resolution informing the people that there was real cause to fear that the reasonable and just applications of that continent to Great Britain for peace, liberty, and safety would not meet with a favorable reception, that on the contrary the tenor of their intelligence and general appearances furnished just cause for the apprehension that the sudden destruction of that colony at least was intended. They therefore urged the militia in general, and the Minutemen in particular, to spare neither time, pains, nor expense to perfect themselves in military discipline, and also passed resolutions for procuring and making firearms and bayonets. In the meantime, delegates were elected for the ensuing Congress. Even in New York, where the influence of administration in the legislature had been sufficient to prevent an adoption of the recommendations of Congress, a convention was chosen for the purpose of electing members to represent that province in the Grand Council of the colonies. In New England, although a determination not to commence hostility appears to have been maintained, an expectation of it and a settled purpose to repel it universally prevailed. It was not long before the firmness of this resolution was put to the test. On the night preceding the 19th of April, General Gage detached Lieutenant Colonel Smith and Major Pitcairn with the grenadiers and light infantry of the army, amounting to 800 or 900 men, with orders to destroy some military stores which had been collected at Concord, about 18 miles from Boston. Notwithstanding the secrecy and dispatch which were used, the country was alarmed by messengers sent out by Dr. Warren. Battle of Lexington. And on the arrival of the British troops at Lexington, about 5 in the morning, part of the company of militia belonging to the town was found on the parade under arms. Major Pitcairn, who led the van, galloped up, calling out, "Disperse, rebels, disperse!" He was followed close by his soldiers, who rushed upon the militia with loud huzzas. Some scattering guns were fired, which were immediately followed by a general discharge, and the firing was continued as long as any of the militia appeared. 8 men were killed and several wounded. After dispatching 6 companies of light infantry to guard 2 bridges which lay at some distance beyond the town, Lieutenant Colonel Smith proceeded to Concord. While the main body of the detachment was employed in destroying the stores in the town, some Minutemen and militia who were collected from that place and its neighborhood, having orders not to give the first fire, approached one of the bridges as if to pass it in the character of common travelers. They were fired on, and 2 of them were killed. The fire was instantly returned, and a skirmish ensued, in which the regulars were worsted and compelled to retreat with some loss. The alarm now becoming general, the people rushed to the scene of action and attacked the king's troops on all sides. Skirmish succeeded skirmish, and they were driven from post to post into Lexington. Fortunately for the British, General Gage did not entertain precisely the opinion of the military character of the Americans which had been expressed in the House of Commons. Apprehending the expedition to be not entirely without hazard, he had in the morning detached Lord Percy with 16 companies of foot, a corps of marines, and 2 companies of artillery to support Lieutenant Colonel Smith. This seasonable reinforcement, happening to reach Lexington about the time of his arrival at that place, kept the provincials at a distance with their field pieces, and gave the grenadiers and light infantry time to breathe. But as soon as they resumed their march, the attack was recommenced, and an irregular but galling fire was kept up on each flank as well as in front and rear, until they arrived on the common of Charlestown. Without delay they passed over the neck to Bunker's Hill, where they remained secure for the night, under the protection of their ships of war, and early next morning crossed over to Boston. In this action the loss of the British in killed, wounded, and prisoners was 273, while that of the provincials did not exceed 90. This affair, however trivial in itself, was of great importance in its consequences. It was the commencement of a long and obstinate war, and had no inconsiderable influence on that war, by increasing the confidence which the Americans felt in themselves, and by encouraging opposition with the hope of being successful. It supported the opinion which the colonists had taken up with some doubt, that courage and patriotism were ample substitutes for the knowledge of tactics, and that their skill in the use of firearms gave them a great superiority over their adversaries.
End of chapter 14, part 1. Chapter 14 of the Life of Washington, Volume 1, by John Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14, Part 2. Although the previous state of things was such as to render the commencement of hostilities unavoidable, each party seemed anxious to throw the blame on its opponent. The British officers alleged that they were fired on from a stone wall before they attacked the militia at Lexington, while the Americans proved by numerous depositions that at Lexington, as well as at the bridge near Concord, the first fire was received by them. The statement made by the Americans is supported not only by the testimony adduced, but by other circumstances. In numbers, the militia at Lexington did not exceed 1/9 of the British, and it is not probable that their friends would have provoked their fate while in that perilous situation by commencing a fire on an enraged soldiery. It is also worthy of attention that the Americans uniformly sought to cover their proceedings with the letter of the law, and even after the affair at Lexington, made a point of receiving the first fire at the bridge beyond Concord. The Provincial Congress, desirous of manifesting the necessity under which the militia had acted, sent to their agents the depositions which had been taken relative to the late action, with a letter to the inhabitants of Great Britain, stating that hostilities had been commenced against them, and detailing the circumstances attending that event. But they did not confine themselves to addresses. They immediately passed a resolution for raising 13,600 men in Massachusetts, to be commanded by General Ward, and called on New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut for their respective quotas to complete an army of 30,000 men for the common defense. They also authorized the Receiver General to borrow £100,000 on the credit of the colony, and to issue securities for the repayment thereof, bearing an interest of 6 per centum per annum. The neighboring colonies complied promptly with this requisition, and in the meantime such numbers assembled voluntarily that many were dismissed in consequence of the defect of means to subsist them in the field, and the king's troops were themselves blocked up in the peninsula of Boston. About the same time, that enterprising spirit which pervaded New England manifested itself in an expedition of considerable merit. The possession of Ticonderoga and Crown Point, and the command of Lakes George and Champlain, were objects of importance in the approaching conflict. It was known that these posts were weakly defended, and it was believed that the feeble garrisons remaining in them were the less to be dreaded because they thought themselves perfectly secure.
Under these impressions, some gentlemen of Connecticut, at the head of whom were Messrs. Dean, Worcester, and Parsons, formed the design of seizing these fortresses by surprise, and borrowed a small sum of money from the legislature of the colony to enable them to carry on the expedition. About 40 volunteers marched from Connecticut towards Bennington, where they expected to meet with Colonel Ethan Allen, and to engage him to conduct the enterprise and to raise an additional number of men. Colonel Allen readily entered into their views and engaged to meet them at Castleton. 270 men assembled at that place, where they were joined by Colonel Arnold, who was associated with Colonel Allen in the command. They reached Lake Champlain in the night of the 9th of May, Ticonderoga surprised. Both Allen and Arnold embarked with the 1st Division, consisting of 83 men, who effected a landing without being discovered, and immediately marched against the fort, which, being completely surprised, surrendered without firing a gun. The garrison consisted of only 44 rank and file, commanded by a captain and 1 lieutenant. Crown Point surrenders. From Ticonderoga, Colonel Seth Warren was detached to take possession of Crown Point, which was garrisoned only by a sergeant and 12 men. This service was immediately executed, and the fort was taken without opposition. At both these places, military stores of considerable value fell into the hands of the Americans. The pass at Skenesborough was seized about the same time by a body of volunteers from Connecticut. To complete the objects of the expedition, it was necessary to obtain the command of the lakes, which could be accomplished only by seizing a sloop of war lying at St. John's. This service was effected by Arnold, who, having manned and armed a schooner found in South Bay, surprised the sloop and took possession of her without opposition. Thus, by the enterprise of a few individuals, without the loss of a single man, the important posts of Ticonderoga and Crown Point were acquired, with the command of the lakes on which they stand. Meeting of Congress. Intelligence of the capture of Ticonderoga was immediately transmitted to Congress, then just assembled at Philadelphia. The resolutions passed on the occasion furnish strong evidence of the solicitude felt by that body to exonerate the government, in the opinion of the people, from all suspicion of provoking a continuance of the war by transcending the limits of self-defense. Indubitable evidence, it was asserted, had been received of a design for a cruel invasion of the colonies from Canada for the purpose of destroying their lives and liberties, and it was averred that some steps had actually been taken towards carrying this design into execution. To a justifiable desire of securing themselves from so heavy a calamity was attributed the seizure of the posts on the lakes by the neighboring inhabitants, and it was recommended to the committees of New York and Albany to take immediate measures for the removal of the cannon and military stores to some place on the south end of Lake George, there to be preserved in safety. An exact inventory of the stores was directed to be taken, in order that they might be safely returned when the restoration of the former harmony between Great Britain and the colonies, so ardently wished for by the latter, should render it prudent and consistent with the overruling law of self-preservation. Measures, however, were adopted to maintain the posts, but to quiet the apprehensions of their neighbors, Congress resolved that, having nothing more in view than self-defense, no expedition or incursion ought to be undertaken or made by any colony or body of colonists against or into Canada. This resolution was translated into the French language and transmitted to the people of that province in a letter in which all their feelings, and particularly their known attachment to France, were dexterously assailed, and the effort was earnestly made to kindle in their bosoms that enthusiastic love of liberty which was felt too strongly by the authors of the letter to permit the belief that it could be inoperative with others. During these transactions, Generals Howe, Burgoyne, and Clinton arrived at Boston, soon after which General Gage issued a proclamation declaring martial law to be in force and offering pardon to those who would lay down their arms and submit to the King, with the exception of Samuel Adams and John Hancock. On receiving intelligence of the Battle of Lexington, New York appeared to hesitate no longer. In that place also the spirit which animated the colonies generally obtained the ascendancy, yet the royal party remained formidable, and it was thought advisable to march a body of Connecticut troops into the neighborhood, professedly to protect the town against some British regiments expected from Ireland, but really with the design of protecting the patriotic party. The middle and southern colonies, though not so forward as those of the north, laid aside the established government and prepared for hostilities. Transactions in Virginia. In Virginia, the governor, Lord Dunmore, had just returned from a successful expedition against the Indians, in which he had acquired considerable popularity. Presuming too much on the favor of the moment and dissatisfied with some recommendations concerning the militia and independent companies made by the Colonial Convention which had assembled in Richmond, he employed the captain of an armed vessel then lying in James River a few miles from Williamsburg to convey to his ship by night a part of the powder in the magazine belonging to the colony. This measure, though conducted with great secrecy, was discovered, and the people of the town assembled next morning in arms for the purpose of demanding restitution of the property which had been taken. The magistrates, having prevailed on them to disperse, presented an address to the governor, remonstrating against the removal of the powder, which they alleged to be the more injurious because it was necessary for their defense in the event of an insurrection among their slaves. The governor acknowledged that the powder had been removed by his order, but gave assurances that he would restore it if an insurrection of the slaves should render the measure necessary. Unsatisfactory as this answer was, no farther means were used in Williamsburg for its recovery. This transaction excited a strong sensation in the interior of the country. Meetings were held in several counties, and the conduct of the governor was greatly condemned. The independent companies of Hanover and King William, at the instance of Mr. Patrick Henry, a member of Congress, assembled and marched for Williamsburg with the avowed design of compelling restitution of the powder or of obtaining its value. Their march was stopped by the active interposition of Mr. Braxton, who obtained from the King's Receiver General a bill for the value of the property that had been removed, with which he returned to the companies and prevailed on them to relinquish a farther prosecution of the enterprise. The alarm occasioned by this movement induced Lady Dunmore to retire with her family on board the Fowey man-of-war lying in James River, whilst his lordship fortified his palace, which he garrisoned with a corps of marines, and published a proclamation in which he charged those who had procured the bill from the Receiver General with rebellious practices. During this state of irritation, Lord North's conciliatory proposition was received, and an assembly was suddenly called, to whose consideration it was submitted. The governor used all his address to procure its acceptance, but in Virginia, as in the other colonies, it was rejected because it obviously involved a surrender of the whole subject in contest. One of the first measures of the assembly was to inquire into the causes of the late disturbances, and particularly to examine the state of the magazine. Although this building belonged to the colony, it was in the custody of the governor, and before admittance could be obtained, some persons of the neighborhood broke into it, one of whom was wounded by a spring gun, and it was found that the powder which remained had been buried, and that the guns were deprived of their locks. Governor Dunmore retires to the Fowey ship of war. These circumstances excited so great a ferment that the governor thought proper to withdraw to the Fowey man-of-war. Several letters passed between him and the legislature, containing reciprocal complaints of each other, in the course of which they pressed his return to the seat of government, while he insisted on their coming on board the Fowey. They were content that he should even there give his assent to some bills that were prepared, but he refused so to do, and the assembly dissolved itself, the members being generally elected to a convention then about to meet in Richmond. Thus terminated forever the regal government in Virginia. Provisional Congress of South Carolina. In South Carolina, so soon as intelligence of the Battle of Lexington was received, a provincial congress was called by the Committee of Correspondence. An association was formed, the members of which pledged themselves to each other to repel force by force whenever the Continental or Provincial Congress should determine it to be necessary, and declared that they would hold all those inimical to the colonies who should refuse to subscribe it. The Congress also determined to put the town and province in a posture of defense, and agreed to raise 2 regiments of infantry and 1 of rangers. Arrival of Lord William Campbell. While the Congress was in session, Lord William Campbell, who had been appointed governor, arrived in the province, and was received with those demonstrations of joy which had been usual on such occasions. The Congress waited on him with an address expressing the causes of their proceedings, in which they declared that no love of innovation, no desire of altering the constitution of government, no lust of independence, had the least influence on their councils, but that they had been compelled to associate and take up arms solely for the preservation and in defense of their lives, liberties, and property. They entreated His Excellency to make such a representation of the state of the colony and of their true motives as to assure His Majesty that he had no subjects who more sincerely desired to testify their loyalty and affection, or would be more willing to devote their lives and fortunes to his real service. his lordship returned a mild and prudent answer. For some time Lord William Campbell conducted himself with such apparent moderation as to remain on good terms with the leaders of the opposition, but he was secretly exerting all the influence of his station to defeat their views, and was at length detected in carrying on negotiations with the Indians and with the disaffected in the interior. These people had been induced to believe that the inhabitants of the sea-coast, in order to exempt their tea from a trifling tax, were about to engage them in a contest which would deprive them of their salt, Osnaburgs, and other imported articles of absolute necessity. The detection of these intrigues excited such a ferment that the governor was compelled to fly from Charleston and to take refuge on board a ship of war in the river. The government was then, as elsewhere, taken entirely into the hands of men chosen by the people, and a body of provincial troops was ordered into that part of the country which adhered to the royal cause, where many individuals, contrary to the advice of Governor Campbell, had risen in arms. The leaders were seized and their followers dispersed. In North Carolina also, Governor Martin was charged with fomenting a civil war and exciting an insurrection among the negroes. Relying on the aid he expected from the disaffected, especially from some Highland emigrants, he made preparations for the defense of his palace. But the people taking the alarm before his troops were raised, he was compelled to seek safety on board a sloop of war in Cape Fear River, soon after which the committee resolved that no person or persons whatsoever should have any correspondence with him, on pain of being deemed enemies of the liberties of America, and dealt with accordingly. As soon as Congress was organized, Mr. Hancock laid before that body the depositions showing that in the Battle of Lexington the King's troops were the aggressors, together with the proceedings of the Provincial Congress of Massachusetts on that subject. The affairs of America were now arrived at a crisis to which they had been for some time rapidly tending, and it had become necessary for the delegates of the other provinces finally to determine either to embark with New England in war, or by separating from her to surrender the object for which they had jointly contended, and submit to that unlimited supremacy which was claimed by Parliament. Even among the well-informed, the opinion that the contest would ultimately be determined by the sword had not become general. The hope had been indulged by many of the popular leaders that the union of the colonies, the extent and serious aspect of the opposition, and the distress which their non-importation agreements would produce among the merchants and manufacturers of the parent state would induce administration to recede from its high pretensions and restore harmony and free intercourse. This opinion had derived strength from the communications made them by their zealous friends in England. The divisions and discontents of the country had been represented as much greater than the fact would justify, and the exhortations transmitted to them to persevere in the honorable course which had been commenced with so much glory had generally been accompanied with assurances that success would yet crown their patriotic labors. Many had engaged with zeal in the resistance made by America, and had acted on a full conviction of the correctness of the principles for which they contended, who would have felt some reluctance in supporting the measures which had been adopted, had they believed that those measures would produce war. But each party counted too much on the divisions of the other, and each seems to have taken step after step in the hope that its adversary would yield the point in contest without resorting to open force. Thus, on both sides, the public feeling had been gradually conducted to a point which would, in the first instance, have been viewed with horror, and had been prepared for events which in the beginning of the controversy would have alarmed the most intrepid. The prevailing sentiment in the middle and southern colonies still was, that a reconciliation on the terms proposed by America was not even yet impracticable, and was devoutly to be wished, but that war was to be preferred to a surrender of those rights for which they had contended, and to which they believed every British subject, wherever placed, to be unquestionably entitled. They did not hesitate, therefore, which part of the alternative to embrace, and their delegates united cordially with those of the North in such measures as the exigency required. The resolution was unanimous that, as hostilities had actually commenced, and as large reinforcements to the British army were expected, these colonies should be immediately put in a state of defense, and the militia of New York be armed and trained, and kept in readiness to act at a moment's warning. Congress also determined to embody a number of men without delay for the protection of the inhabitants of that place, but did not authorize opposition to the landing of any troops which might be ordered to that station by the Crown. The Convention of New York had already consulted Congress on this subject, and had been advised to permit the soldiers to take possession of the barracks, and to remain there so long as they conducted themselves peaceably, but if they should commit hostilities or invade private property, to repel force by force. Thus anxious was Congress, even after a battle had been fought, not to widen the breach between the two countries. In addition to the real wish for reconciliation, sound policy directed that the people of America should engage in the arduous conflict which was approaching with a perfect conviction that it was forced upon them and not invited by the intemperate conduct of their leaders. The divisions existing in several of the states suggested the propriety of this conduct, even to those who despaired of deriving any other benefit from it than a greater degree of union among their own countrymen. In this spirit, Congress mingled with the resolutions for putting the country in a state of defense, others expressing the most earnest wish for reconciliation with the mother country, to effect which that body determined to address once more an humble and dutiful petition to the King, and to adopt measures for opening a negotiation in order to accommodate the unhappy disputes subsisting between Great Britain and the colonies. As no great confidence could be placed in the success of pacific propositions, the resolution for putting the country in a state of defense was accompanied with others rendered necessary by that undetermined state between war and peace in which America was placed. All exports to those colonies which had not deputed members to Congress were stopped, and all supplies of provisions and other necessaries to the British fisheries, or to the Army or Navy in Massachusetts Bay, or to any vessels employed in transporting British troops to America or from one colony to another, were prohibited. Though this resolution was only an extension of the system of commercial resistance which had been adopted before the commencement of hostilities, and was evidently provoked by the late act of Parliament, it seems to have been entirely unexpected, and certainly produced great distress. Massachusetts, having stated the embarrassments resulting from being without a regular government, at a time when an army was to be raised to defend themselves against the butcheries and devastations of their implacable enemies, and having declared a readiness to conform to such general plan as Congress might recommend to the colonies, it was resolved that no obedience is due to the act of Parliament for altering the charter of that colony, nor to officers who, instead of observing that charter, seek its subversion. The governor and lieutenant governor, therefore, were to be considered as absent and their offices vacant. To avoid the intolerable inconveniences arising from a total suspension of government, especially at a time when General Gage had actually levied war and was carrying on hostilities against His Majesty's peaceable and loyal subjects in that colony, it was recommended to the Convention to write letters to the inhabitants of the several places which are entitled to representation in the Assembly, requesting them to choose such representatives, and that such assembly or council exercise the powers of government until a governor of His Majesty's appointment will consent to govern the colony according to its charter. These resolutions were quickly followed by others of greater vigor, denoting more decidedly a determination to prepare for the last resort of nations. It was earnestly recommended to the conventions of all the colonies to provide the means of making gunpowder and to obtain the largest possible supplies of ammunition. Even the non-importation agreement was relaxed in favor of vessels importing these precious materials. The conventions were also urged to arm and discipline the militia, and so to class them that one force should be minute-men. They were also requested to raise several regular corps for the service of the continent, and a general resolution was entered into authorizing any province thinking itself in danger to raise a body of regulars not exceeding 1,000 men to be paid by the united colonies. Congress also proceeded to organize the higher departments of the Army, of which Colonel George Washington of Virginia was appointed commander-in-chief. Bills of credit to the amount of $3 millions were emitted for the purpose of defraying the expenses of the war, and the faith of the 12 confederated colonies was pledged for their redemption. Articles of war for the government of the Continental Army were formed, though the troops were raised under the authority of the respective colonies without even a requisition from Congress, except in a few instances. Manifesto of Congress. A solemn, dignified declaration in form of a manifesto was prepared to be published to the army in orders and to the people from the pulpit. After detailing the causes of their opposition to the mother country, with all the energy of men feeling the injuries of which they complained, the manifesto exclaims, "But why should we enumerate our injuries in detail? By one statute it is declared that Parliament can, of right, make laws to bind us in all cases whatsoever. What is to defend us against so enormous, so unlimited power? Not a single man, to those who assume it, is chosen by us, or is subject to our control or influence, but on the contrary they are, all of them, exempt from the operation of such laws. and an American revenue, if not diverted from the ostensible purposes for which it is raised, would actually lighten their own burdens in proportion as they increase ours. We saw the misery to which such despotism would reduce us. We for 10 years incessantly and ineffectually besieged the throne as supplicants. We reasoned, we remonstrated with Parliament in the most mild and decent language. The manifesto next enumerates the measures adopted by administration to enforce the claims of Great Britain, and then adds, we are reduced to the alternative of choosing an unconstitutional submission to the tyranny of irritated ministers or resistance by force. The latter is our choice. We have counted the cost of this contest and find nothing so dreadful as voluntary slavery. Honor, justice, and humanity forbid us tamely to surrender that freedom which we received from our gallant ancestors, and which our innocent posterity have a right to receive from us. We cannot endure the infamy and guilt of resigning succeeding generations to that wretchedness which inevitably awaits them, if we basely entail hereditary bondage upon them. Our cause is just, our union is perfect, our internal resources are great, and if necessary, foreign assistance is undoubtedly attainable. We gratefully acknowledge, as signal instances of the divine favor towards us, that his providence would not permit us to be called into this severe controversy until we were grown up to our present strength, had been previously exercised in warlike operation, and possessed of the means of defending ourselves. With hearts fortified with these animating reflections, we most solemnly, before God and the world, declare that, exerting the utmost energy of those powers which our beneficent Creator hath graciously bestowed upon us, the arms we have been compelled by our enemies to assume, we will, in defiance of every hazard, with unabating firmness and perseverance, employ for the preservation of our liberties, being with one mind resolved to die freemen rather than to live slaves. Lest this declaration should disquiet the minds of our friends and fellow subjects in any part of the empire, we assure them that we mean not to dissolve that union which has so long and so happily subsisted between us, and which we sincerely wish to see restored. Necessity has not yet driven us to that desperate measure, or induced us to excite any other nation to war against them. We have not raised armies with ambitious designs of separating from Great Britain and establishing independent states. We fight not for glory or for conquest. We exhibit to mankind the remarkable spectacle of a people attacked by unprovoked enemies, without any imputation or even suspicion of offense. They boast of their privileges and civilization, and yet proffer no milder conditions than servitude or death. In our own native land, in defense of the freedom that is our birthright, and which we ever enjoyed until the late violation of it, for the protection of our property acquired solely by the honest industry of our forefathers, and ourselves against violence actually offered, we have taken up arms. We shall lay them down when hostilities shall cease on the part of the aggressors, and all danger of their being renewed shall be removed, and not before. Some intelligence respecting the movements of the British Army having excited a suspicion that General Gage intended to penetrate into the country, the Provincial Congress recommended it to the Council of War to take measures for the defense of Dorchester Neck and to occupy Bunker's Hill, a commanding piece of ground just within the peninsula on which Charlestown stands. In observance of these instructions, a detachment of 1,000 men commanded by Colonel Prescott was ordered to take possession of this ground, but by some mistake Breed's Hill, situate nearer to Boston, was marked out instead of Bunker's Hill for the proposed entrenchments. The party sent on this service worked with so much diligence and secrecy that by the dawn of day they had thrown up a small square redoubt, without alarming some ships of war which lay in the river at no great distance. As soon as the returning light discovered this work to the ships, a heavy cannonade was commenced upon it, which the Provincial sustained with firmness. They continued to labor until they had thrown up a small breastwork stretching from the east side of the redoubt to the bottom of the hill, so as to extend considerably their line of defense. As this eminence overlooked Boston, General Gage determined to drive the Provincials from it, and for this purpose detached Major General Howe and Brigadier General Piggott at the head of 10 companies of grenadiers, and the same number of light infantry with a proper proportion of field artillery. These troops landed at Morton's Point, but perceiving that the Americans waited for them with firmness, they remained on their ground until the arrival of a reinforcement from Boston, for which General Howe had applied. During this interval the Americans also were reinforced by a detachment under the command of Generals Warren and Pomeroy, and they availed themselves of this delay to strengthen their defenses with some adjoining posts and rails, which they pulled up and arranged in 2 parallel lines at a small distance from each other, filling the space between with hay. so as to form a complete cover from the musketry of the assailants. The British troops, on being joined by their second detachment, advanced slowly in two lines under cover of a heavy discharge of cannon and howitzers, frequently halting in order to allow their artillery time to demolish the works. While they were advancing, orders were given to set fire to Charlestown, a handsome village which flanked their line of march and which was soon consumed. It is not easy to conceive a spectacle more grand and more awful than was now exhibited, nor a moment of more anxious expectation. The scene of action was in full view of the heights of Boston and of its neighborhood, which were covered with spectators taking deep and opposite interests in the events passing before them. The soldiers of the hostile armies not on duty, the citizens of Boston, and the inhabitants of the adjacent country, all feeling emotions which set description at defiance, were witness of the majestic and tremendous scene. Battle of Breed's Hill. The provincials permitted the English to approach unmolested within less than 100 yards of the works, and then poured in upon them so deadly a fire that their line was broken, and they fell back with precipitation towards the landing place. By the great exertions of their officers they were rallied and brought up to the charge, but were again driven back in confusion by the heavy and incessant fire from the works. General Howe is said to have been left at one time almost alone, and it is certain that few officers about his person escaped unhurt. The impression to be made by victory or defeat in this early stage of the war was deemed so important that extraordinary exertions were used once more to rally the English. With difficulty they were led a third time to the works. The redoubt was attacked on three sides, while some pieces of artillery raked the breastwork from end to end. At the same time a crossfire from the ships and floating batteries lying on both sides of the isthmus, by which the peninsula is connected with the continent, not only annoyed the works on Breed's Hill, but deterred any considerable reinforcements from entering the peninsula. The ammunition of the Americans being nearly exhausted, they were no longer able to keep up the same incessant stream of fire which had twice repulsed the assailants, and the redoubt, which the English mounted with ease, was carried at the point of the bayonet. Yet the Americans, many of whom were without bayonets, are said to have maintained the contest with clubbed muskets until the redoubt was half filled with the king's troops. The redoubt being lost, the breastwork was abandoned, and the hazardous movement was accomplished of retreating in the face of a victorious enemy over Charlestown Neck, exposed to the same crossfire which had deterred the reinforcements from coming to their assistance. The detachment employed on this enterprise consisted of about 3,000 men, composing the flower of the British army, and high encomiums were bestowed on the resolution they displayed. According to the returns, their killed and wounded amounted to 1,054, an immense proportion of the number engaged in the action. Notwithstanding the danger of the retreat over Charlestown Neck, the loss of the Americans was stated at only 450 men. Among the killed was Dr. Warren, a gentleman greatly beloved and regretted, who fell just after the provincials began their retreat from the breastwork. At the time, the colonial force on the peninsula was generally stated at 1,500 men. It has been since estimated at 4,000. Although the Americans lost the ground, they claimed the victory. Many of the advantages of victory were certainly gained. Their confidence in themselves was greatly increased, and it was asked universally how many more such triumphs the invaders of their country could afford. The British army had been treated too roughly to attempt farther offensive operations. They contented themselves with seizing and fortifying Bunker's Hill, which secured the peninsula of Charlestown, in which, however, they remained as closely blockaded as in that of Boston. The Americans were much elated by the intrepidity the raw troops had displayed and the execution they had done in this engagement. They fondly cherished the belief that courage and dexterity in the use of firearms would bestow advantages amply compensating the want of discipline. Unfortunately for the colonies, this course of thinking was not confined to the mass of the people. It seems to have extended to those who guided the public councils, and to have contributed to the adoption of a system which more than once brought their cause to the brink of ruin. They did not distinguish sufficiently between the momentary efforts of a few brave men, brought together by a high sense of the injuries which threatened their country, and carried into action under the influence of keen resentments, and those steady, persevering exertions under continued suffering which must be necessary to bring an important war to a happy termination. Nor did they examine with sufficient accuracy several striking circumstances attending the battle which had been fought. It is not easy to read the accounts given of the action without being persuaded that, had the Americans on Breed's Hill been supplied with ammunition and been properly supported, had the reinforcements ordered to their assistance entered the peninsula as soldiers in habits of obedience would have done, and there displayed the heroic courage which was exhibited by their countrymen engaged in defense of the works, the assailants must have been defeated, and the flower of the British army cut to pieces. It ought also to have been remarked that while the few who were endowed with more than a common portion of bravery encountered the danger of executing the orders they had received, the many were deterred by the magnitude of that danger. But it is not by the few that great victories are to be gained or a country to be saved. Amidst these hostile operations the voice of peace was yet heard, allegiance to the king was still acknowledged, and a lingering hope remained that an accommodation was not impossible. Congress voted a petition to His Majesty, replete with professions of duty and attachment, and addressed a letter to the people of England, conjuring them by the endearing appellations of friends, countrymen, and brethren, to prevent the dissolution of that connection which the remembrance of former friendships, pride in the glorious achievements of common ancestors, and affection for the heirs of their virtues had heretofore maintained. They uniformly disclaimed any idea of independence, and professed themselves to consider union with England on constitutional principles as the greatest blessing which could be bestowed on them. But Britain had determined to maintain by force the legislative supremacy of Parliament, and America was equally determined by force to repel the claim. End of chapter 14, part 2. End of The Life of Washington, Volume 1, by John Marshall.